family representatives who are here. I know Patricia Elotu is representing UN Women. The boss at the Ministry of Finance, the Permanent Secretary and Secretary to the Treasury, Ramadan Ngovi. I really don't envy you right now with the economy, but the Ministry of Finance, colleagues who are here, the civil society organizations. I see our former ED at the NGO Forum, who was the boss of the NGOs in Uganda, Richard Sewachirianga, who will have a big part of the ceremony he will be managing and handling this morning. The CS-BAG Executive Director, Julius Mukunda, all the civil society organization representatives who are here, the different representatives of the agencies, the MDAs, and of course, friends of the UN family, and members of the Fourth Estate. I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us. We quickly want to dig into the program this morning, but just a quick run through. We will have, of course, the opening remarks by our PSST, and then later dive into the report itself by the Ministry of Finance, and then we will have a panel discussion, which Richard will be handling, to also share with us insights into the report, because we'll get more insights into the report during the panel discussion that will include different stakeholders, including a Member of Parliament, the World Bank, our statisticians at UBOS, and of course the private sector, including a representative of the youth. So that will be happening shortly. And before that, we may adjust the program quite a bit when our chief guest arrives to allow for the formalities to happen when he's here. So may I now take the singular pleasure and honor of inviting Ramadan Ngovi, the Permanent Secretary and Secretary of the Treasury, to come and make opening remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, round of applause.
Thank you very much, Maurice. The Honorable, I haven't seen a Member of Parliament. There is an Honorable Member of Parliament I recognize, the UN Resident Coordinator, a UNDP Resident Representative, and also the head of FAO, my good friend there. I'm matching your hairstyle now one of these days, where that mine is a little bit timid. The honorable distinguished guests, in all your capacities, ladies and gentlemen, I take this opportunity to welcome you to this Poverty Status Report 2021 launch workshop. This launch provides a platform on which my ministry continues to engage you on social economic policy using evidence-based research to support improvement in the welfare of Ugandans. Our main target today is actually to listen to the current status as far as government's role in fighting poverty is concerned, but most importantly to pick lessons to strengthen our strategy as well as policy actions to fighting poverty. The Poverty Status Report for 2021 builds on the previous two reports, that is the one in 2012 and 2014, by addressing itself to Uganda's national target of attaining middle income status. This is discussed in the perspective of jobs, informality, as well as their effects on household welfare. The theme of the report we are launching today, as I'm sure you have been given a copy, is Jobs, Informality, and Poverty in Uganda: Insights on Performance Before and During COVID-19. And this theme is in line with our transformative agenda of moving households from low productive sectors to the high productive sectors of the economy. The report provides analysis and insights into the notion of subsistence agriculture, and government remains committed and continuously provides to its citizenry a conducive environment as well as appropriate interventions for sustainable economic transformation. These include, among others, Entandikwa Poverty Eradication Action Plan. We had Operation Wealth Creation. Now we are having the Parish Development Model. We have Emioga, among others. All of these are intended to support Ugandans who are at the base of our pyramid to come up. Furthermore, this poverty status report has introduced a national multidimensional poverty index to complement the income measure of poverty in Uganda. Vulnerability to poverty has also been extensively analyzed in this report. The analysis in the report has taken into consideration the effects of COVID-19 pandemic by using the 2019-20 household survey that was conducted before and during COVID-19. This was an unprecedented shock to the majority of the household's welfare. Ladies and gentlemen, the results of the report were validated on the 28th of July last year here in Kampala at a hotel next to this one, Serena. We are now here to share and discuss with you the final results of the study. It is through these engagements and discussions that as a ministry and government at large are able to sharpen our interventions and deliver better services to the citizens. I would like to thank our partners, the United Nations Development Program, for their technical and financial support. We thank you very much. I would also like to acknowledge the technical collaboration between my ministry, the Uganda Bureau of Statistics, the Economic Policy Research Center, and the World Bank during this study. And most of the people, I've seen them in the house. My team was led by the commissioner responsible for research in this country, micro research, Joseph Enyim. Give him a hand clap, very hard-working man. I've seen the ED of EPRC, Dr. Sewanyana. You are very most welcome, and thanks for all the effort. She deserves a hand clap as well. I have my OB, whom when I was entering the ministry, I found him, he was working with Joseph on this. JB, John Bosco Liema, is one of the smartest economists in this country. JB is among very few Ugandans who beat me in class. There were not many. Lastly, I take this opportunity to thank all of the different stakeholders physically present and those who are attending virtually for taking keen interest in engaging my ministry on this report. We look forward to your objective feedback on key areas of improvement and what needs to be done to ensure that the next report actually brings a number of milestones for us to move as a government in the fight against poverty. I thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you very good discussions. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, another round of applause for the Permanent Secretary and Secretary at the Treasury. And just before I forget, I think, Joseph, I think your performance review was done here. So clearly you've done a good job at the ministry. And the PSST, as your supervisor, has already, I think, signed off your performance review today. So we want to thank you, PSST, for finding time. And I know you have a very busy schedule later today. And you may disappear before Joseph concludes his presentation. So this is really where the meat meets the bone. And we want to look at the data. What does the data tell us? And listening to the PSST, government has, of course, initiated projects and rolled out initiatives to drive to bring more people out of poverty. And the latest, of course, being the drive to increase the number of people in the money economy. And so he ran through the different projects and programs that government is already running. But the question is, everyone is asking at the moment, where are we at as a country, given the effects of COVID-19? And I can't wait to look at the data of before COVID and the impact of COVID on our people. And we saw several reports by different stakeholders during COVID about more people falling back into poverty during COVID. So the status of poverty in Uganda and by how much, the role of economic growth, which the PSST is mandated to drive, in poverty reduction, has this weakened, and what are the needs for further study that we need to look at based on the data and numbers that Joseph will be looking at us. The pattern of income poverty, comparing to 2019, 2020 before COVID, and of course after COVID, and the status, the current status where we are at now. Of course, journalists in the room will be saying where we are at in 2023, because this report is really about 2021. But that is really what Richard, I think, and the panel will also be digging into a little later. So I now take the pleasure, first of all, I think, Elsie, to recognize the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Tourism, who's joined us. Thank you for joining us, PS. So may I now take the pleasure of inviting the Commissioner in the Ministry of Finance, Planning, responsible for research, Joseph Enyimu, to come and take us through this presentation of the Poverty Status Report 2021. Ladies and gentlemen, round of applause.
The honorable members of parliament, if they are present in the room, the resident coordinator of the UN family, the resident rep of UNDP, and the PS and PSST, and the PS Ministry of Tourism. Senior government officials in the room, the media fraternity, and distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's my privilege to walk you through the key messages of the report to be launched, and I have since learned that in fora like this, you are supposed to speak to Omuntu wa bulijo. So I'm going to endeavor to keep this very simple and short so that we can get to benefit from the full scope of the messages. Shall we go to the next slide? In this presentation, we seek to address ourselves to a few questions, and there are 6 in total. We want to understand what has changed about the status of poverty in Uganda and by how much. We'll interest ourselves on where this change occurred, what has driven the change, what and where are the success stories as far as poverty reduction is concerned. what has changed also in our understanding of poverty since the last status report. And finally, we'll interest ourselves on what are the lessons for increasing shared prosperity. We'll proceed and explore the problem that merits the report that we are launching today. There are broadly three aspects that motivate this report. One is the broad recognition that the socio-economic transformation pace of the country has been relatively slow and needs to be speeded up. And there is a commitment to speed up progress to this end in line with the visions in 2040, including our middle-income status target for Vision 2040, which is USD $9,500. The second one is that productivity gains remain below the thresholds for actualizing Uganda's demographic dividend, a major feature of NDP 3. There is broad awareness of the urgent need to better labor market outcomes so that they can match the rapid pace of urbanization and counter the large share of subsistence and informality in national output, as well as in the structure of employment in the country. And the third major motivation is the weak linkages between macro and microeconomic outcomes within the context of a changing economic base. Essentially, we are discussing the linkages between our middle-income ambition versus the actualization of a middle-class society. So there is appreciation that there is a requirement for deeper spatial analysis and a better understanding of the linkages between public spending, service delivery, and household welfare. As far as the methodology of the report is concerned, PSST informed us that we are in the third PSR within the era of NDP, and the thematic focus of this report relative to the other two is rather distinct. It is focusing on jobs, informality, and poverty in Uganda, and addresses itself, of course, to a major phenomenon that happened during this period, and that is COVID-19. The report has benefited from some major background studies, and these were done in collaboration with a range of our development partners. Notable among them is a study by the government and the World Bank towards a better labor market in Uganda. And then we also did work with UNDP on the dynamics of vulnerability in Uganda. And another study with UNDP was on multidimensional poverty in Uganda. And this also included the technical leadership of the Bureau of Statistics. And we conducted a mini participatory poverty assessment exercise that gave us a report on transitioning to formality for improved productivity. And finally, we did work with the World Bank and EPRC on poverty measurement in Uganda. And we asked the question, is it time to revisit the poverty line? This report, given the lag since the previous one, has benefited from a number of data sets. Notable amongst them is the 2019-20 UNHS, as well as the previous ones, but also the panel survey series, the latest being 18-19. The report introduces a number of new concepts, which is our next slide. And the first is arguably not new, but it's important for our conversation. We are saying income poverty exists when consumption expenditure per adult equivalent is below the poverty line. The idea here, of course, is that in a household, there are many people. Some are young, others are old, and so you need to standardize their consumption to analyze them as similar units. The other major concept is that of vulnerability to poverty, which is defined in the report as the likelihood of becoming poor in the future. It's a new, relatively new definition on this space. And then we make significant use of the concept of chronic poverty. And this means poverty that persists over time and can be passed across generations, from one generation to the next. Another new concept in the report is that of multidimensional poverty, which is being deprived on more than one dimension or indicator of welfare. And then finally, the report addresses itself also to the issue of the middle class, and this makes reference to households whose per capita consumption is more than twice the poverty line. And in the context of dollar measures, the African Development Bank defines those households as households whose daily expenditure is between $2 and $4 US. With that background, I think we can quickly run to the findings of the report, and we address ourselves to the first set of findings. What has changed about the status of poverty in Uganda and by how much? What we see in this graph is a double-edged message. One is that the general trend of poverty continues to be downward. And when that is compared with the general trend of economic growth, you realize that there is a change in the direction of these graphs. In the early set prior to 2009-10, you could see that as growth was on the higher part of the graph, poverty was coming down, which is what would be expected if growth is poverty reducing or is pro-poor. Beyond 2010, we see poverty continuing to go downward, but average economic growth falls below. And the point there is that there are other factors explaining this reduction in poverty beyond just economic growth. And so the message is that the role of economic growth in poverty reduction has weakened, and it's an area we need to study further. I hope our panel will help us with ideas in that regard. The second message in this segment is that the pattern of income poverty in 2019 is similar across all published poverty lines. There has been debate on whether the country's poverty line is still relevant or is it too low. But the good news is that the direction, the trend, regardless, or rather the pattern, regardless of the poverty line you use, is similar. And so that debate can continue, not in the sense of the direction, but maybe the actual nominal measure. The other message we take away is that the trend of income poverty is consistent also across different poverty lines. Next slide, please. So not only is the pattern the same for a given period, when we look at the trend across different years, we see that it follows the same direction regardless of the poverty line you use. There we have used the international poverty line and then the national poverty line to compare that. The other major message is that living conditions have improved over time, with more people having moved out of poverty than those who have fallen in. Poverty is dynamic. As we speak here, some people are moving out and others are falling in. So it's important that you understand the net position. And using the panel survey, we try to follow particular households over time. And so we can see there that 11.5% of those households that were poor in 2013-14 have successfully transitioned to the middle class, while 30.64% of those who were vulnerable have made it to the middle class, and 67.6% have been able to maintain their status in the middle class. And that is no mean achievement. we see that of those who were in the middle class in 13-14, or rather, yes, only about 5% fell back into poverty, meaning that the strategies that are pulling people out of poverty are doing so sustainably. But of course, we are also concerned about the middle numbers there, the non-poor or the vulnerable. They remain very large. 47.82% remained in that position, almost half. And those can easily slip back if not well addressed. Next, please. Looking within the middle class, we notice two major characteristics. One, it's largely urban based. As you can see from the green, the urban areas dominate the people who are in the middle class. But also what's interesting is the trend in the rural areas. It is lower in share, but it is steadily emerging. Unlike the urban area where there was a dip in the last 2 years, you notice that in the rural areas, the rise has been consistent. And so that is another message we take away about the middle class in Uganda. And we then discuss the linkages between the macro and micro levels of the economy. And the message we pick away from here is that the national development ambition needs to be reflected both at the macro and micro levels of the economy. Economy like us that aspires to be a middle-class society, or rather aspires for middle-income status, should equally see its middle-class society grow commensurately. And this is a society that is expected to have a sustainable standard of living and is associated with relatively high real income. And using the national target, we made an assumption that if output equals to expenditure and that equals to income, that target of USD 1039, which was the NDP 2 target, translated using the 2009-10 prices to an average of about 878,000 shillings per month per household of 5 people. If you use the prices of 1920, that means that national target would require a household to have a monthly income of about 1.6 million shillings. And when we analyze the levels of consumption in the country that match that figure, we see that just about 10% of the population had attained middle income status, or the status of a USD 1,039 dollars per capita by 2019-20. So is that the level of ambition that we sought to achieve? That's a question really we need to reflect as a country as we set these macro level targets. What do they mean at the household level? The second set of findings has to do with where the change in poverty occurred. And we highlight a few things here. The picture is somewhat mixed, but what is important is maybe to take note of the reversals. So West Nile is a very unique region in the sense that the reduction in poverty there has consistently, has been consistent. It has had no reversals. There is no other region that performed that way. Where we see some major reversals of concern is Toro, which has consistently risen. Buganda North also is experiencing a consistent rise, despite being lower than the national average. And then Kigezi, you can see that across the 3 periods, it has also risen there consistently. There are major reversals around Lango, Ankole, and Acholi between the last 2 periods, and then also the Karamoja region. So those areas merit attention in terms of what explains those reversals. Why were they not able to sustain their reduction? And we later talk about that. The report goes ahead to look at the spatial performance, but at district level. UBOS was able to provide us data that allowed this analysis. And when we do this against the NDP2 targets, we see that 7 districts out of 146 were able to achieve the NDP2 target by 2019, leaving 139 missing. And if you take that further to the sub-county level, we see that just over 100 sub-counties achieved that NDP2 target, which was a big ambition. 14% poverty reduction. Level of poverty is a comparatively very low level in the region we are in. Now, the number of sub-counties here, that is as of 2019-20. There may be more today because there have been some further divisions. Then we interest ourselves in terms of inequality. There are 2 messages. One is that overall inequality has reduced in Uganda. But some regions have experienced increases. And that is in Buganda South, Elgon region, where poverty fell, inequality increased. In Karamoja, and then again, Toro experiences also an increase in inequality, a very significant level, about 25%. What explains these patterns we are seeing? One, we see that for Lango and Acholi, it is really the performance of poverty in urban areas that explains the reversal that we saw in those areas. So the urban livelihoods and economy were more hit compared to the rural ones. The other distinct thing the report establishes is that the lockdown impacted poverty reduction negatively, especially for the border districts, and you can see that in the maps in the report. And then we see that natural disasters were very critical in explaining a lot of this spatial performance. In particular, floods and poor harvests in 2019-20. Areas that suffered from this had a disproportionately higher negative impact. And also, interestingly, the impact was significant where registered land rights were low. And so the whole discussion of land governance comes into the picture. And then areas that suffered from drought, and these were Karamoja, also were negatively impacted in terms of household consumption levels. The other distinct factors the report picks on are population pressure and trade barriers, and this largely explains performance for areas in southwestern Uganda, and that is Ankole, as we saw earlier. And then finally, seasonal agricultural gains are the main reason for the good performance in Elgon, West Nile, and the reversals, positive reversals in Bukedi and Busoga. We can proceed to the third set of findings. What has driven the change in poverty beyond the spatial analysis I've just commented on? 2 broad factors. Factors that are systemic, which means they affect more than just, at the household level. And there are those that are household specific. And on the systemic ones, we saw drought, crop pests and diseases, floods, and then COVID-19. At a household level, the characteristics of a household, level of education, whether you have access to power and all those things. And then the shocks that are experienced within the household, household size, the issue of dependency ratios, and then whether the household is engaged in a formal or informal type of employment. So the next slides speak to this summary by giving you the magnitude of impact. As you can see, households that suffered floods had on average a higher poverty rate than those that didn't suffer by those numbers. And then also drought and crop pests and diseases. And all these figures are statistically significant. So we can take comfort that they measure that change. The next has to do with the COVID-19 restrictions, where we compare border districts versus interior districts against the national average. And you can clearly see that border districts performed less than those in the interior as far as poverty reduction was concerned. And from a geographical point of view, we see that poverty and subsistence rates mirror each other. You can see that where there is a high level of poverty, which is represented by the darker colors, you also see a very high level of subsistence activity. And is it which causes the other? But the point is addressing subsistence economic livelihoods is critical, really, to reducing poverty. And you can see that that same phenomena mirrors with the way that registered land rights perform across the country. Areas that have particular land tenure systems are associated with a larger share of subsistence economic activity and therefore higher poverty compared to those where land rights have higher registration rates. The specific rates are included in that next graph, and partly it could speak to the issue of the incentive to invest. It's very hard for you to invest heavily on land where you don't have security of tenure. And consequently, when shocks come, you are not able to mitigate because you have not adequately prepared. All right. We also see, and this is unique to the household, that small-scale farming continues to suffer from low returns. Between the periods being compared, you can see that for those families engaged in small-scale farming as the main income source, poverty reduced between 1617 and 1920, but it is still the highest at 26.5, having fallen from 30. And then you can also see that households that relied a lot on remittances suffered an increase in poverty of about 18%, of about 6, an increase of about 6, taking them to 18%. As far as household characteristics are concerned, the report establishes that education remains a key route out of poverty. And given the large share of the population that has not completed primary or even post-primary education, we contend that TVET, Technical Vocational Education and Training, could be the bridge to reaping Uganda's demographic dividend, because you have to find a way of raising the productivity of those people who have not been able to advance in their educational attainments. The other message is that adult literacy also matters for poverty reduction, and we see an inverse relationship geographically. Areas that have higher literacy levels tend to be associated with lower rates of poverty, and I think that is on account of the fact that you are able to seize opportunities more. From a financial sector perspective, we see that accumulation of capital through saving mechanisms influences poverty levels. These are the different saving mechanisms that were covered, and the poverty rates associated with the different mechanisms clearly vary from one to the other. So you can see where there are no savings, the poverty rate also is very high, and as you move towards more formal saving instruments, the poverty rates come down. And so that speaks to our financial sector reform agenda. We also see something about financial inclusion using mobile money penetration rates. And we see that areas with higher penetration rates correlate with those that have lower poverty because, of course, of the transaction costs and access to opportunities that come with those platforms, including remittances. As far as the type of employment of the household is concerned, we see that informal employment is highly associated with lower welfare. And that informal employment takes on different characters. They are those which have to do with written contracts. You can see that people that have written contracts have a higher level of welfare compared to those with oral contracts. And we also see those who have the privilege of taking a sick leave perform better than those who don't. And then those who can also afford annual leave in their employment still perform better. Or if you put it the other way, those without perform lower. And then whether or not somebody has a pension provision, you can see that those without are had a lower welfare by 58%, more than half. The next set of findings addresses our attention to what the reduction success stories were. If poverty reduced, as we have seen, where and what explains that reduction as far as success parameters are concerned? What interventions can we associate with that reduction? And we took the major flagship interventions of government. You could see that households that benefited from free inputs under the Operation Wealth Creation clearly having lower rates than those that didn't benefit by almost 8 percentage points. Those that are beneficiaries of the social assistance grant for empowerment also perform better than their counterparts. And then the Youth Livelihood Program, UWEP, has the biggest margin at 23%. And then NUSAF. Interestingly, NUSAF and the Youth Livelihood Program are not statistically significant, so you require more confirmations on those two programs, despite the figure being reasonable. What were the decelerators of poverty beyond those social programs that we've looked at? You can see that when you compare communities with these interventions against those without, communities that had a new road 3 years before the survey had a lower rate of poverty. Those that received a new electricity access within a 3-year period, poverty was lower by over 10%. Where there was a new health facility in the area, a new school, and then development projects that we talked about. The health facilities were not statistically significant, but it goes to confirm that, community level public infrastructure matters for poverty reduction. And then what has changed in our understanding of poverty? This is the new knowledge that has come on the table. One of the new pieces of information, of course, the report brings is that poverty is not just measured using one variable. It is that multidimensional. The way you experience poverty is more than income. And at the launch of the multidimensional poverty index report, we were taken through the details of these dimensions. Essentially, we measure these by deprivations and indicators that measure those deprivations. The dimensions are 4 that Uganda has chosen: education, health, living standards, and then employment. And we have 12 indicators against that. And so you will acquaint yourself with the details, but you can clearly see that in the report, there are households that were doing well in terms of income, household consumption, measuring their welfare. But when you look at the same households using other forms of deprivations, you see that they are poor in those dimensions. So it is not enough, particularly in areas like Kampala, where income poverty is low. Deprivations as far as sanitation is concerned were very high. And the findings using those dimensions are that multidimensional poverty is much, much higher than income poverty, almost double. And you can also see the regional variations of those points between the 2 periods that the statistics were generated. Next. The other major message is that vulnerability has taken on a higher rank as a development challenge in Uganda and is now amongst Uganda's foremost development challenges. A growing proportion of Ugandans are frequently afflicted by the natural disasters we already saw, and the level of shock is disproportionately higher for people employed in subsistence agriculture and wage employment. So using that definition of the probability of becoming poor in the future, you can see that more than half of the population was classified as highly vulnerable using the panel survey of 1819. The prediction for 2020 is that more than half of our population could easily slip back into poverty. And it is going down. I think that's a good trend compared to other predictions. And we see that for those who are not vulnerable, unfortunately, that one is rising as you move from the latter years to the forward years. So it is something we need to pay attention to. And that is the map. The darker the colors, the higher the vulnerability. It's just a geographical representation. So ladies and gentlemen, with all those findings, we came up with just 10 conclusions broadly. Number 1 is that generally, poverty is on a long-run decrease, and that is welcome news. What we are doing is working. It can be made to work better. The second point is that if it were not for COVID, we would have performed much better in our poverty reduction effort. The other point is that poverty hotspots in the north and the east persist. And then informal employment is associated with higher poverty. So what we do with the formality of businesses and jobs is very critical. Household characteristics drive poverty, levels of education, access to social services, and population size, household size. All those issues matter for poverty reduction. We also conclude that government provision of public goods and services indeed has a positive effect on reducing poverty. The government's public investment program is impacting on poverty reduction. And then we say addressing vulnerability to poverty is an imperative. We cannot bury our heads in the sand on this matter. We have to address it head on. We observe that multidimensional poverty exceeds income poverty. And finally, linkages between macro and microeconomic outcomes have weakened, especially the poverty reduction content of growth. On the basis of those conclusions, we make a few recommendations, 5 categories in total. One is the organizational capacity of households needs to be increased so that they can engage better in commodity markets. If we are to realize farming as a business, that is something that needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed in the context of sub-national regional value chains. Fortunately, the PDM is speaking to that space. The second recommendation is about de-risking the economy and livelihoods. And we propose a range of interventions given the rising vulnerability. Market-based and public sector-based interventions to this end are critical. We are saying we need to scale up access-tied public investment. Not all public investment improves access to public services, and so where it does, those needs to be scaled up because we have established their relationship with poverty. And then we need to strengthen employment governance. If we are to address the issue of high informality, it has been established, it's strongly associated with the poverty, high poverty rates. And so, helping businesses and employees formalize their contracts. And we propose some of the opportunities there. And then finally, we have more research to do in these areas where the findings were not conclusive. I thank you for your attention. That is the summary of the report we are launching today. Thank you very much.
Surely we can do better than that. Another round of applause for Joseph Enyimu. Thank you very much, Joseph, for extensively covering the report. And if you want a copy of the full report, do let us know. The team at the back should be able to share with you a link so you can download the report, so you can actually dig in yourself and look at the numbers. I am happy we are dealing with SDG number 1. Ending poverty in all its forms for everyone. And I am also happy that Joseph spoke to the multi-dimensional approach in addressing SDG 1, which is where you must address issues of health, issues of energy, issues of sanitation, and as we have seen, you also have to support the education infrastructure. And I'm glad in his conclusion he does speak to a way forward that I'm sure the panel will delve into. I was very excited, Joseph, first of all, to see that one of the government programs, the Women Entrepreneurship Program, is actually working. What's actually shocking is that very recently we were hearing that PDM was actually going to replace OWEP. And so it makes a case now for some of us who are going to say you need to keep this program because it's working and it's done a good job. The other highlight for me was the grant, the social grants that are actually being provided to the elderly and the disadvantaged communities. It's amazing the impact of such on the community and how you support the vulnerable people in the communities that were highlighted. The one slide I didn't see, which I actually now believe is similar to your slides, is the slide around the health or the different vulnerable communities when it comes to things like tuberculosis and leprosy, and of course other diseases. When you look at the map, the Ministry of Health map, and your map along the lines of poverty, it's actually the same. It's the border communities. And unfortunately, some of my areas are also in the same area. So when I talk about Kisoro, I fall there somewhere in your numbers. And so you look at Kisoro, you look at the northeastern region, and of course parts of West Nile. You look at your data, and it speaks to the same issues. And what are those interventions government will be speaking to in the next few years to reduce the number of people falling back into poverty? Now, for me, the biggest risk is the fact that half of our people are vulnerable. And that, for me, is really dangerous. So, Richard, I will be looking at how your team will help us understand how we can get more people out of that vulnerable group that could easily fall back into poverty and join the 11%. For me, this data was very eye-opening. But there is other people here, Elsie, joining you to look at this data. The IMF country representative, Isabella Kapovic, is here with us. We have the World Bank team. We have both the lead economist, Tom, and senior economist, Rachel, who are also here with us from the World Bank. We want to thank you very much for joining us. So I want to quickly run into the panel discussion. So may I invite Richard Sewachirianga, who is our moderator for the panel today. Richard is a senior research fellow at the Center for Basic Research. Formerly, he was the executive director of the NGO Forum, an organization that brings together all the civil society organizations here in Uganda. He's probably been in this space for the last 40 years, not to tell you his age, but he looks quite young for his age. So Richard, you're welcome. You are welcome to invite your panel. If I interfere with your discussion at some point, I beg your apology, but I'm managing the time. We may not affect the first session. We may affect the plenary session, but you're welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, round of applause for Richard.
So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Richard Sewachirianga, a senior research fellow at Center for Basic Research. But Maurice and others just want to remember me as working at the NGO Forum. I used to work at the Ministry of Finance with Joseph at the Economic Development Policy and Research. I used to be in charge of participatory poverty assessments. So let me align myself with that identity also, so that you don't rob me from my history. And many years ago, so we are not going to count the years. Now, I have a panel which is very interesting, and I hope they are all here. I have seen Rachel, so Rachel, you are welcome to take your seat. Rachel is the senior economist at the World Bank. She's been with us for... Oh, okay. Okay. So Rachel has been replaced by Tom. So Tom, who is the replacement of Rachel, please come. Apologies, I didn't get that replacement, but welcome, Tom. Tom is from the World Bank also. Thank you very much for coming. Dr. Sarah Sewanyana, you are also welcome. At least I came with her this morning, and I know she's here. She's from the Economic Policy Research Center. Who is the most familiar person with what we are going to talk about. So the rest, you don't have to know anything. You just talk to Sarah and she will understand for you. Then Dr. Chris Mukiza is around. He has also been replaced by James Muwonge. Yes, James Muwonge is a historical like myself, but nobody can guess our age. So that's a great thing. James Muwonge, please welcome. And then we have Kakungulu Walugembe. Is he around? Mr. Walugembe? No? No. And then Jacob Yeru. from the National Youth Council. He's on his way. Okay. Now, when you come from the National Youth Council and you're on your way, we have a challenge with that, but we hope that when he comes, he can join us. So what I'll do is I'll sit down, since we have some space for us to sit down, and then we will go through the discussions. And the way we are going to do this is they gave us very little time. Maurice put here 45 minutes, and everybody here can speak for 45 minutes. So we are going to try and create a conversation and keep it at that. Okay. Patrick Kichoncho Katabazi from the Uganda Parliamentary Forum for Social Protection. I hear you. Oh, he's my good friend, so I don't know why I hadn't noticed. But thank you very much, Patrick, for coming. He's going to speak on behalf of Honorable Flavia Rwabuhoro. At least I saw her in Saudi Arabia on social media. So I'm sure she's doing a good job trying to make sure that we deal with that problem there. So I think our panel is now complete, apart from one person that we are missing. So I'll sit down and then we start the discussion.
2012, growth in Uganda was very strong, and poverty reduction also was very strong. What we've been seeing as of 2012 or so is a slowdown in growth. So if you look at growth in GDP per capita, what actually matters for living standards, it has been quite volatile and on average quite weak between 2012 and 2020. When I look in the report that Mr. Joseph presented, we also see that poverty has basically slowed down. So if I remember correctly from my reading on the plane, poverty was about 20% in 2012, using the old poverty line, and it was about 20% in 2020. So we're basically seeing a stagnation in poverty at the time when growth was falling, correct? So I think that's, so Mr. Joseph can correct me if I'm wrong, but my reading is that when growth in Uganda was very strong, poverty reduction was very strong. When growth in Uganda started to decrease, to slow, as of 2012, poverty reduction also started to slow. And of course, we had a series of shocks, such as the droughts, the COVID-19 shock, which makes that, of course, poverty rates have been sticky. But in general, what Uganda, in my opinion, will need to achieve in order to kind of rekindle its strong poverty reduction is just much stronger economic growth. So back over to you, Richard.
Okay. That helps to explain because, some of us were wondering what is going on there. But let me go to another quick question, and I'll come back to you on a number of things. And that is, I think, James, you will have to deal with this because what we are seeing is they are telling us that some interesting things are happening. 9.7% of Ugandans could be somewhere in the middle class. And they have said that this is Enyumu called it a back of the envelope calculation. I don't know what that means, but I think it is an informal calculation. But then I think the other one is to say that the percentage is 38.2% using the African Development Bank, calculations of between $2 to $4. So the discussion and what the report is telling us is that there's quite a bit happening. And then I think the report also tells us that in terms of vulnerability, we are seeing quite a bit of challenges there. That actually the numbers could be anywhere up to 70% of Ugandans who are at the risk of vulnerability. But what do we do to make sure that we don't leave anyone behind? What are the things that need to happen when you look at the data. You are a data person, so I don't want a political message. I just want a data message to say what does the data tell us about what needs to be done to get these numbers in a good place, especially to reduce vulnerability as it looks like.
Thank you, Richard. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. In terms of numbers, it's, as Richard, as Joseph indicated, yes, vulnerability is high. But also, if you noted, he said the highest percentage is in those engaged in agriculture. And that's where the largest share of the population is. And so I think, to me, what is key is also one category of vulnerable population, or vulnerable group. We need to also to identify all the different budget. Hello? So we need to identify all the vulnerable groups and be able to target them. The danger of the risk is talked about, of some of those falling into the likelihood of falling back into poverty and in and out using the panel data. I think what it brings out is that the cross-sectional data gives you a position that is as of that date. But the panel is able to tell you what is happening to this individual or this group of population of people over time. And now, those who are vulnerable, the vulnerability, I think the key thing is to also be able to tell you and to show you what are those bottlenecks that are keeping these people, in that state of risking to continue to be vulnerable. And so I think we need to do much more in terms of providing the necessary data across the board to make sure that we are able to identify all of those to be able to bring them out. Yes.
Thank you. Okay, how about multidimensional poverty? You sort of, the statistics have gone into that direction where you are telling us that that is something to worry about. But the thing is that when we look at all those dimensions and we still have the debate, why did you choose those dimensions? But before you go into that, what is the implication of this multidimensional poverty and how high it is versus other interventions that we need to do on poverty?
Thank you. I think as the report shows, from the 90s, we've been using income poverty as a measure. But also what multidimensional poverty shows is that income is good. It's an enabler, in my view, but it's not the only one. And so there are these other dimensions that keep people deprived. And these are different dimensions. So the report touches on some of them. For instance, there is free access to primary education, but there is a significant proportion of pupils or children who are out of school. So the question is, if they are, and some of these households are not income poor, but children are not in school. So it's not about income, but it's other factors. So we need the multidimensional element brings in that discussion, that we need to broaden the discussion and focus on a number. Maybe given that there are so many interventions already the government is putting in place, perhaps we also need to look at how they complement each other to make sure that they target the right audience or the right people to be able to address those other dimensions that seem to be holding people back in as far as deprivations are concerned.
Thank you. I think let me go to you, Sarah, because we now have an issue that is totally unresolved, and I'll go back to this middle income, middle class discussion. The data seems to suggest that this is largely an urban phenomenon, although they say it's, what did Enyim said, increasing, relatively increasing in the rural. But what do the statistics tell us? Can we actually become middle class from what you have? And I don't want you to say anything politically correct. It's just the statistics and what they tell us. I know some people have already declared that we are middle class, but let's hear what is it? What are the numbers saying?
It's on, eh? Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Joseph, for your presentation. Before I get to your question, I wanted to come back to the question that was posed to World Bank, that economic growth is weakening the poverty reduction. I wanted to be able to break down where this economic growth is coming from. Whenever agriculture does not grow, we expect poverty in Uganda to increase. So if we don't pay a lot of attention to agriculture, we shall continue seeing what we are seeing now. Two, I think we should also stop trying to focus so much on the percentages and focus more on the absolute numbers. Much as the way the graph showed us from the presentation, that poverty is going down, but in terms of the number of poor persons, the numbers are increasing. Increasing, yes. So I think we need to combine several figures for us to be able to give a full picture of what is happening to poverty in Uganda. Then number two is what I've picked from the presentation from Joseph, that we need to really be able to understand the nature of poverty. Okay? So when you look back to most of the interventions that government has tried, there is more focus about the poor. But we need to move away from that kind of thing, given what he has presented to us. We need to understand this nature. Are they chronic? Are they whatever? So that we target them accordingly. The other one is on the measurement itself. I'm bringing these ones out because even if I answer the others without understanding this, it will not really help us a lot. Now, when you go back to the figures that Joseph presented on the middle income, middle class, right? He was using the old poverty line, the $1 a day, which is now less than even $1 a day now. But if we had used the new poverty line, the picture would have been completely different. Okay? So we need to be open and address the measurement issues around the poverty in Uganda so that we can be able to address the issues the way one would have loved to see. And when you are measuring the middle income class and you are using the cross-section data set, as James put it, it will not really give you an idea. So I thought that one of the recommendations that was going to come out of the report, that we need to increase investment in big data or data collection or something like that, so that you can be able to measure and inform policy accordingly. We need to really beef it up. When it comes to middle class, more in urban areas, that is expected. To me, I don't think that is a surprise. That is expected because that's where even the economy and so on, the GDP is in the urban areas. But what we are forgetting, that poverty is also increasing in urban areas. So if it increases and we don't really pay a lot of attention, even in the middle class we speak to, in urban areas will be lost. Okay? So there are some concerns that are coming out of the middle class people, which government has also to give attention to. We don't talk about taxation and so on. To me, I think those are some of the concerns that we need also to speak to. I stop, eh?
Well, thank you. I think you have helped us a bit, especially to help us understand the poverty lines and all those definitions. But now let me talk to my colleague, Patrick, who is working on issues of social protection. As you can see from what the report tells us, the drivers of poverty seem to be in places driven by things like drought, pests and diseases, the pandemic itself. So it looks like we sort of have quite a bit of things going on there. Joseph also used some very interesting language when he said that we need to de-risk livelihoods. I don't know what you meant, and I know a lot of English, so if I didn't understand, I'm going to ask my colleague to say, when we come to issues of social protection, what do you see we should be emphasizing on? I know Joseph, I know you very well, so when I keep referring to you, please, you know that I'm referring with a lot of data. Joseph actually did feminist economics many years ago. And I read this report and I didn't see an analysis that takes us into the intra-household dynamics and the gender dynamics of what is going on. Because at some point you talked about household characteristics driving poverty. And I was wondering if there is a gender issue there that we need to understand. But from a social protection point of view, what do you see, what does this report tell you, and what messages are you taking away? Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. First of all, the report highlights social protection very strongly. And the word social protection itself is mentioned over 20 times in the report. That shows how significant social protection interventions are being viewed as a major tool in the fight against poverty. In a summary read by Joseph, when you read the report in detail, it highlights the need for scaling up social protection interventions using a life cycle approach. Because you realize, for example, the indication made about chronic poverty, the poverty that is passed from generation to the other. Social protection would be, in my view, the only method that would break that chain. And we are seeing social protection vulnerability moving across the life cycle. So nobody is born poor, for example. Nobody is born poor, for example, but a child is born into poverty. So now what happens at that stage? If a child is born into poverty, it means that a child comes to life in an environment of vulnerability. It means that that child may not access good nutrition, ingredients. It also means that that child may not be able to go to school. It also means so many other things that moves across the life cycle. But again, ultimately, you also see that that child may end up being extremely vulnerable even in old age. So it therefore means that for us to break the cycle of poverty, investment in social protection using the life cycle approach will be our magic bullet. I want to highlight one of the examples mentioned in the report, that the correlation between poverty and social protection programs, and other government programs is negative Save for the Senior Citizens Grant, as an example, where the report is indicating that the investment in the Senior Citizens Grant is giving us benefits in terms of reduction of poverty in the targeted category. And I want to side with the recommendation made in the report that this evidence, and indeed many other pieces of evidence that have been made or that have been produced on the Senior Citizens Grant, should be compelling on government to reduce the age from the age of eligibility from the current 80 years down to 65 to be in tandem with the original intention of the Senior Citizens Grant program. There are equally many other programs that government is partnering with development partners. For example, the Child-Sensitive Social Protection Program, which is being implemented in West Nile. The results that are coming there are good, and the same would be replicated in the rest of the country, so that we start targeting vulnerability at the young age, so that we are able to build the resilience of our population right from the age as they go through the life cycle approach. So I think the recommendations on social protection are spot on by the authors of this report, and we should support them so that government as well can make appropriate resource allocation to these programs. Thank you.
Thank you. But your addition is that the age should come back to 65.
Yes, the age should come back to
65.
To 65.
Because many of us, 80 is quite a long distance away. Okay, so thank you very much. Mr. Walgembe Kakungulu has joined us. He speaks passionately about issues of the informal sector.
Yes, sir.
Have you had a chance to look at the report? And if you have, now that I see it is in your hands, one of the findings that came out in the discussion here was that informal employment reduces welfare, that informal employment is not good for poverty reduction. Now, I know that we did some work with James Mwonge here and the International Labour Organization on measuring informality. And we actually found that not very many people want to become formal. So why don't people want to become formal? And yet we know that by becoming formal, we shall reduce poverty more. What are your thoughts about this finding on informality?
Okay, so firstly, I agree with the report. The report is clear that informality exposes people to poverty because, of course, the nature of employment is that there's no minimum wage, there's limited social protection, and so on. But we can look at it in two ways, and I think the report articulates that very well. One is there must be benefits to formalization, not from the government's point of view, but from the business's point of view, because business people are rational. They weigh their costs and benefits, and if they feel that it's extremely costly to formalize, then they won't. But also they look for benefits that accrue from formalization. And what I can say is that at the moment, we do not have a clear value proposition for a business person to formalize. We the elite speak about formalization from our perspective. We want to increase the tax base, we want to address poverty. But that is not the concern of a small business owner. A small business owner wants to understand, if I formalize, what do I get? I must clarify this very clearly. What's the difference between me, an informal business, and my colleague who is formal? If the benefits are clear, then it will be easy for people to formalize. So this lack of a clear value proposition from government as a whole, what is a formal business entitled to? In some cases, the informal businesses actually benefit more from government than the formal ones. And I'll give an illustration. If we talk about a myoga, if I'm going to look at the beneficiaries, if we did an analysis of the beneficiaries, we shall find that actually informal businesses have benefited more from the myoga than the formal ones. What do formal ones benefit from government? tax assessment. If you file late with URA, you get an assessment of 200,000 and so on. So every time the business environment and the regulatory environment is too punitive and too complex, we make things difficult. We have been computerizing. Now, I'm also a business owner, because some people think I speak for small businesses and I don't. I run my own business. But sometimes digitalization has become a problem, and I'll give you an illustration. If I need a tax clearance certificate, previously I would go to a tax office and say, please, I have, my deadline is on Monday, can we expedite this? What can I do? And so on and so forth. Now, when you send in your application, you look at the system and it's pending. You wait, deadline, pending. When you call people, did you submit? Yes, it's pending. So every time we have those kinds of hurdles, we make formalization difficult. So we must simplify the regulatory regime, because business people don't want to waste time complying. We must reduce the cost of complying. But most importantly, we must put in place clear benefits between formal businesses and informal businesses.
Yeah, but how can we do that? Because, I mean, for URA, or the Honorable Minister who is here, is
Yes.
looking at what he collects in terms of, the taxes that come in. What do you see as, I mean, if you were to give him a proposition so that
Yes.
he doesn't have to think alone, what should the minister do?
Okay, so what the minister ought to do is to say that every year, as URA, we are going to support actively, provide support, say, to 100,000 businesses. Not just dishing out tin numbers, because that's what I see is happening. Dishing out a tin number, you are creating more problems, because, yes, you're increasing the tax register, but these are not effective taxpayers. This is just a theoretical tax register. We want to support people to actually grow their businesses. It could be advice, whatever. Within those first 3 years, I'm not asking for tax. I'm simply giving them advice. Do this, do that, do this, do that, do that. Making life easy for them. In the third year, I say, based on your turnover now, you need to pay presumptive tax. So I'm moving with this guy from year 1, and in year 3, he becomes a presumptive taxpayer. I go with him to year 4. You know, I'm able to support his growth. And I'm not saying URA needs to work alone. Needs to work with other ecosystem actors like ourselves and others. So we need to not look at these small businesses as merely sources of tax, but as future sources of tax, and therefore support them along the way. So I would say, let's support them. Let's first, let's start by clearly communicating what are the benefits. 2, let's support them on the journey. Then at some point, we shall reap the benefits.
Okay, so please clap for him, since he has given us a groundbreaking idea around how to sort of bring in the informal businesses into a formal. Tom, I want to speak about something else in the report that has been raised a bit here. It looks like we still are struggling with the questions of inequality. Inequality seems to be lingering. When you read the numbers, it seems that we haven't yet had a very good grip on it, both within the regions, but also across the whole economy. What would you say we should be thinking about, especially around inequality and poverty? Because if we are going to reduce poverty and increase inequality, we still are going to go back into maybe a much more complicated zone. But what are your thoughts on this?
Okay, thank you, Richard. So, look, inequality or distributional issues are always important. There's a lot of research been done that basically shows higher inequality countries, they need more economic growth to achieve the same poverty reduction compared to lower inequality countries. So inequality is definitely an important issue when it comes to poverty reduction. Now, if I followed Mr. Joseph's presentation well, inequality has actually come down a bit from, what was it, 2016 until now. So while inequality remains relatively high at about 42 or so a Gini, that has not been the key issue in Uganda recently. So to sound like a broken record, the key issue recently has been the lack of growth. So household consumption expenditures, according to report, the report has not grown. Actually, it even decreased a little bit, if I remember well. So distributional issues are crucial for poverty reduction, but for this particular period in Uganda, it has not been the key issue. The key issue has been kind of slowing growth. And there it is important to keep on hammering on what my panelist to the right has said, is agriculture. The bulk of Uganda's population is still in agriculture, and especially the poor. And if we look at the statistics, agriculture between 2012 and 2020, on a per capita basis, has actually not grown. It has declined. So we can't really expect a lot of poverty reduction if the sector where the poor are active is actually not growing. And that, of course, given that agriculture is a quarter, give or take, of Uganda's economy, it also translates into overall growth. So if agriculture isn't growing, we can't expect overall growth to be strong, and we can't expect poverty reduction to be strong, and we can't expect inequality to go down, because most of the poor are in agriculture. So to bring inequality down, which means giving an extra boost to poverty reduction, we need to get growth in agriculture going. And I think there was a second part to your question, which by now I forgot. So if you can kindly repeat.
I will pass it because you have answered a little bit about with it in your first response. But let's go to James very quickly before we transit. We heard from the report that 139 districts did not meet the NDP target for poverty reduction, which is 14%. But tell us a little bit about how UBOS sort of did this kind of analysis around at the level of districts in terms of their poverty reduction. What is it that you were looking at? Is this just income poverty? What were you measuring? Is multidimensional poverty at the district level?
Thank you. We poverty at the district level. We try to look at statistical methods, which combines household survey data with census information, so that you're able to infer and come up with estimates at lower levels. And so for the different districts, it's possible to look at the poverty levels at district level. And we've been doing this for a couple of years, starting with the previous censuses and the household surveys. So one is able to look at what has happened over time. But also, I think they have also applied some models to be able to bring out some of those that are actually the rates, the percentages, where they have had more growth than others. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Sarah, let's talk about land and poverty. It seems the numbers are telling us that, which is true in many sectors, that we still have quite a bit of challenges when it comes to tenure systems and how they impact poverty reduction. But what does the research say in this area from this study?
Okay, thank you so much. Once again, land is something that is very interesting to speak to. And I wanted to come back again to the agriculture, because land tenure impacts on agriculture. And areas where you see very serious land issues like the Kabale or whatever, you see their poverty also going up. And if we talk about land and agriculture and poverty, when you look at what we have in Uganda, that land, our increase in land in the agricultural production is coming from expansion of land. Okay, we are not really intensifying. We are not using the high yielding technology as such. So if it is coming from land, and land is not really expanding as such, then it will definitely impact on agriculture. And when you talk about land tenure, you cannot leave out the issue of gender. It's very, very critical because gender, we find that women still have issues in terms of accessing land and so on. And we have these 14 PIMA commodities, which are regarded as cash crops or something like that. So when you look at some of those commodities, it is very clear that women may not participate in those commodities because of the underlying land issues. So again, you are going to find that it is mainly men who are going to benefit probably out of that. Women will continue with their food crops and so on. And we are doing some work on sugarcane in Busoga and other sugar growing areas. And you see that land is really becoming a very big issue. So addressing the issues of land is very, very critical in terms of our poverty agenda is very, very critical that we need to really address it. And if it were possible, I don't know how, we should really get politics out of land, but it is, I don't know. Because what we are also seeing in terms of the land tenure, because the big investors cannot access land, we are seeing that government is giving away public land to some of these big investors, and it's not really something good. We would have supported the smallholders because the smallholders are the ones who are really holding this economy. Me getting money and I give it to one person, land to give it to one person, I don't think it is really good in terms of inclusive growth and so on. So land issues are still a big issue. Yes.
And as you say, we need to decide. But again, we know that land has a colonial legacy. It has many things. We're also launching a study to try and look at how do you create constructive engagements between different tenure holders, because I think the critical problem is the courts have failed, the communities have failed, the economy is suffering, and we need to start doing something about land.
But I think the communities can be able to do something around themselves.
Yeah, but
let us support them to organize themselves.
Yeah, but there are many interests, as you said, on land. So
Yes.
every interest wants to be supported, including the big interests. So, but we are not starting a debate on land here. We are just looking at Maurice, who is going to kick us out for a short while. But I also know that Jacob has arrived and he's going to talk about youth issues in the report. I'm going to dish them out. After the minister gives us some wise words, we shall come back and listen to you and also go to the plenary. So we are not yet done, so you will all have a chance to say something. Over to you, Maurice.
Thank you, Richard. Please, you can now take your older seats, not these new ones. A round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. Richard will be back, I promise, and also we'll take questions. So there will be a plenary session where we can ask as many questions, and Joseph will be here in case there is a specific question directed to the Ministry of Finance. Joseph is also available. Honorable Minister, I want to take the pleasure of recognizing your presence as our chief guest, the Honorable Henry Musasizi, the Minister of State for General Duties in the Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development. Ladies and gentlemen, round of applause for our chief guest. Honorable Minister, I don't have that authority to invite you, so there will be a couple of people that will do that, don't worry, to come and speak. But I wanted to speak to one or two issues. Joseph did a fantastic job, Honorable Minister, representing the Ministry of Finance with the report. You found part of the discussion, and I'm glad Dr. Sarah speaks to the issues around land reforms. It's very clear in our report. that the issues related to land greatly determine the poverty levels of our people. And Joseph was very categorical on the issues around that and why we need to address issues around land management. It's very clear that especially where people don't have ownership, a sense of ownership on the land, there is no development on that land. But that relates to the issues around subsistence farming, and those households that are still under subsistence, Honorable Minister, appeared to be very vulnerable. And it's clear in the report that some of the government interventions, including the brand new baby PDM, is set to address those issues. But Honorable Minister, the report was also very clear on the fact that, and I'm happy it was in his conclusions, Joseph, that we need to address the issues around agriculture insurance, because our people are struggling with drought and pest control issues, but also how much support are we able to give them to increase the productivity on their land. What was also clear, Honorable Minister, as I want to sound like Joseph, is that the higher literacy levels or the level of education, the more you stayed in school, the more you stayed away from poverty. It's very clear that the higher the level of education, the lesser the numbers in that poverty bracket. And so our biggest challenge now, especially even with primary education, has been the level or the number of children dropping out of school. So we are seeing a lot of children join school at primary 1 level, but half of them, I think, are only completing primary 7, which for us is a big risk. And that means we have more people falling back into poverty. But the biggest statistic, Honorable Minister, was that half of our population is vulnerable and that it could fall into poverty. So for me, I thought I would share that. But one of the very successful stories out of Joseph's report was that some of your interventions as government, like the Women Fund, the UWEP, the Women Enterprise Program, is actually working. And it brought about 50% of the people in the program came out of poverty. So, Honorable Minister, I think, as many were saying, since there is money under PDM going to women, you are not going to continue financing the women's program. I think we now need to rethink that strategy and keep the money for the women in the government programs. That said, allow me to take the singular honor of inviting the UNDP resident representative, Elsie, to come and make her remarks. Elsie, I request you then to invite our resident coordinator and request the resident coordinator to invite the Honorable Minister, so I don't have to come back. All right, thanks, Elsie. Round of applause, ladies and gentlemen.
A very creative way of inviting others today. First of all, let me recognize Honorable Henry Musasizi, Minister of State for General Duties, Minister of Finance, Planning and Economic Development, and also Acting Minister of Finance, as I understand. Dr. Ramadan Gobi, the Permanent Secretary in absentia, my own very sister, P.S. Katusime, who is here with us, senior government officials. In a special way, let me recognize Her Excellency Susan Ngongi Namondo, our United Nations Resident Coordinator in Uganda, but also the United Nations family, FAO representative, WHO, UNCDF, IFAD, UN Women, our extended UN country team, the World Bank, AFDB, IMF, thank you all. Members of the diplomatic corps, heads of government agencies and departments, private sector, academia, civil society, media, guests online, viewers on television, ladies and gentlemen, let me simply say all protocols observed. And good morning once again. Good morning. Before I get started, let's also give a round of applause one more time to Joseph and the panel. I think they did a fantastic job. So on behalf of the United Nations Development Program, and indeed our entire United Nations family, and I'm glad the RC is here to support this as well, I'm honored and wish to convey our deep appreciation for your participation today as we launch the Poverty Status Report, PSR 2021, in quote. I congratulate the government of Uganda through the Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development upon this milestone of producing, let me use the abbreviation, PSR 2021, the last one having been produced in 2014. UNDP is honored to have collaborated with the Ministry of Finance during the entire process of producing the report. The PSR 2021 provides an update on Uganda's poverty dynamics over the last 5 years, between 2016 and 17 and 2019-2020, with a focus on jobs, informality and poverty in Uganda, insights on performance before and during COVID-19, and how this has influenced household welfare and structural transformation in the economy. The report comes just over half a year after launching of the National Multidimensional Poverty Index report on 28 July 2022, which complements income poverty measures presented in this very report today. Both reports act as a benchmark to track Uganda's progress in reducing poverty in all forms in line with the Sustainable Development Goal #1, but I also want to say by extension all the other SDGs. Honorable Minister, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, what are the key findings of the Poverty Status Report? And I'm not going to go into that because Joseph did a very fantastic job, but just let me highlight a few things, as he said, just to refresh our minds. To begin with, using the $1 per day poverty line, Uganda has registered a reduction in poverty before COVID from 21.4% in 2016, 2017 to 18.7% in 2019. But this gain has reversed and poverty has increased to 20.3, that is 8.3 million Ugandans in 2019-2020. So 16.9 million Ugandans, 41.2% of the total population live below the 1.9 per day poverty line. I think that has been established. In addition, again, the northern region and parts of the eastern region remain the epicenter of poverty in the country. I think this is very important because it also helps us to shape our policy interventions and our program interventions and our finance interventions as we go along. Furthermore, the eastern region, which has been known for extreme poverty, registered a decline in poverty rates from 35.67% in 2016-17 to 29.2% in 2019-2020, while the central region experienced a slight decrease in the poverty rate from 8.9% in 2016-2017 to 8.3% in 2019-2020. Last but not least, according to the National Multidimensional Poverty Index report for Uganda, 42.1% of the total population are multidimensional poor. While this represents a reduction from 44.3% recorded for the year 2016-2017, it is still more than double the income poverty. Again, the eastern and northern regions have the highest proportion of the population in multidimensional poverty, with some sub-regions such as Karamoja, Acholi, are registering a multidimensional poverty headcount ratio exceeding the national average. I must add that the report highlighted major drivers of poverty being systemic shocks such as drought, animal and crop pests and diseases, storms, and of course the COVID-19 pandemic. The impact of drought and pests and diseases was more pronounced yet again in the northern parts than in other regions of the country. So, Honorable Minister, without going into all the details, noting that your team did a fantastic job, I just wanted to highlight some of the key implications for us. What are the key implications of these findings? And I just wanted to highlight three things very quickly. First, evidence. Evidence tackling poverty requires understanding of who are the poor, and I think the panel talked about it. Where do they live? What are the occupations and living conditions of the poor? How are the poor more likely to be affected from any shocks? Why are they more likely to be affected? And what do they need? These questions may seem simple, but in fact, they are the key to determining effective targeting, appropriate interventions, and whether actions have indeed been pro-poor. The second, measurement. there is a need to look beyond income criteria in assessing poverty or development progress. Both Uganda's Vision 2040 and the Global 2030 Agenda are a broad-based agenda which calls for Uganda to look beyond income criteria to assess poverty by publishing multidimensional poverty index reports periodically. A related point is that measurement alone is not enough. Government must make deliberate, and all of us development partners, to utilize the findings to determine, again, effective targeting and design appropriate interventions. And then finally, in terms of the implications, third is our development strategy. There is need to find and implement accelerators for structural transformation. In other words, trying to address not the symptoms, but the causes. The pace of Uganda's structural transformation needs to be enhanced to tackle, for example, youth employment challenges, as well as multidimensional poverty. So let me highlight a few of those accelerators, as I mentioned, in relation to the third point that I raised. What are these accelerators for Uganda's transformation? Now, accelerating the SDGs is an imperative, again, for the success of the NDP3 Vision 2040. The lessons learned from our Uganda Voluntary National Review shows that these are areas that we need to pay attention to. So what are these accelerators? What does it mean? And again, please allow me to cite recommendations from a dynamic study or analysis of sustainable development goals on how best Uganda can achieve this and can accelerate. And UNDP, together with the National Planning Authority and the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, UNECA, undertook a study in 2020 to examine the potential medium to long-term, again, impact of NDP3 on Uganda's development, and came out with areas that we could call SDG accelerators. And there were 3 accelerators that were discussed. One of them, environment. I think it came out very much in the presentation in terms of the impacts of drought, climate, and others. 2, governance. And 3, industries as the priority investment areas that can push that acceleration forward. And governance here, we are not talking about only civil liberties or political rights. We are talking about the governance of things, including natural resource governance, the governance of the internet, and many other things that we can talk about. And the study or analysis clearly showed that governance interventions in NDP3 have the highest overall impact on the SDGs, an average of 1%, and the positive effect on SDG number 12 to 17. Again, environmental interventions have the highest average return on investments, which is about 26.8% improvement for every percentage of GDP spending, and a positive effect particularly on SDGs number 14 to 17. Again, industry interventions, and I know that our colleague from the Federation of Small and Medium Scale Enterprise talked about that. Industry interventions have the second highest average return on investments, and I don't want to go into the statistics of that, otherwise I'll lose all of you. But I think the message here is that we need to focus on certain accelerators. But beyond governance, environment, and industry, there's need for interventions in human capital development, again, which includes health, education, water and sanitation, and of course, in infrastructure and agriculture as one of those areas that we can push. Honorable Minister, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, let me underscore key areas to take us forward in terms of our recommendations, and I'll highlight a few, noting that we can't all be exhaustive here, and I'm hoping that we'll have subsequent conversations to take this forward. What can we do? What are some of the things that we can practically do? First is on industrialization and regional trade. These are key for socioeconomic transformation, export revenues, job creation, poverty reduction, and rapid and sustained prosperity in developing countries like Uganda. Development experience shows that industrialization will contribute to inclusive growth, resilience, increased living standards, and transformation of the economy and society. And in particular, Honorable Minister, I need to say that we need to boost our national production and industrialization efforts and aggressively implement the National African Free Trade Continental Area Agreement strategy to position Uganda as a first mover into niche markets in Africa. Again, when you work back, looking at the conversations on our agriculture and linking that back to trade, there's a need for us to look very critically around issues around trade investment with the Africa Free Trade Continental Area Agreement in focus. We have 1.4 billion people in Africa. This is the biggest free trade area in the world, and we need to be able to take advantage of that. I must also underscore the importance of promoting private sector development as a key to driving industrialization and the trade agenda. There is urgent need for a competitive incentive mechanism, and I think that is what Mr. Walugembe talked about, to promote small and medium-scale enterprises development and attract both domestic and foreign private investment in sectors that have a strong multiplier effect on growth. Again, the successful implementation of the parish development model can be a major driver for boosting production and driving industry from the local economic base. The second thing, and it's not because I saw the PS for tourism here, it was already in my notes, it's related to trade, but also trade in services, particularly tourism, which is key to reducing poverty and is well poised to be Uganda's leading development sector with high transformative power in the country. Honorable Minister, this is a low-hanging fruit. Uganda is arguably one of the most beautiful countries on earth. And this year, I think CNN recommended that the 25 countries to visit includes Uganda. And I think we can take advantage of it. There's so many things that we have that the world would like to see. And again, if you work back, when somebody goes on a tourism experience, it's not just about going to look at a beautiful space. They would eat, the farmer would get something, they would take transport, the driver would get something. And again, when you connect it back to the Wananchis, it's jobs for the youth, for women, and for all those who are vulnerable. Thirdly, I think we need to pay attention again to universal access to clean and renewable energy. This is very, very important. The National Multidimensional Poverty Index report of Uganda highlights that about 2/3 of households face deprivations in terms of access to energy or electricity. For these households, the introduction of clean energy solutions can bring vital services such as improved health care, better education, affordable broadband, creating new jobs, livelihoods, and sustainable economic value to reduce poverty. And two things very quickly as I wrap up and conclude. I think I want to also emphasize as a fourth thing, again, the investments in human capital. I know that Joseph talked about TVET. This is great. We need to focus on that, skilling of the youth. But we also have to look at new ways of doing things. We live in a very digitalized world, digital skilling. What is the job for the future? As we speak now, a lot of the work is being done in the metaverse. And are we positioned for some of these things? So again, how do we position our young people and to make sure that they can be competitive when it comes to the future of jobs? And finally, we need to invest in setting incentives. We need to invest in innovations. We need to invest in insurance. And our recent UNDP report, Human Development Report, concludes by saying that in the world where we have so much uncertainties, when we have crisis, we need to focus predominantly on three things: invest in incentives, invest in innovation, and invest again in insurance. And again, in the case of Uganda, we can unpack that. Honorable Minister, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, as I conclude, I would like to thank once again the government of Uganda, through you, Honorable Minister, through the Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development, for partnering with UNDP and indeed our larger United Nations family in developing the Poverty Status Report 2021, and for co-hosting this launch. It is my hope that the outcomes of this report would influence the fight against poverty in all its forms and deliver the development aspirations that leave no one behind. I pledge the continued support of UNDP and our system to drive this agenda forward in terms of Uganda's Vision 2040 and the country's Sustainable Development Goal agenda. I wish us all very fruitful deliberations. Thank you very much. And on that special note, I have the singular privilege and honor to introduce our United Nations Resident Coordinator, Her Excellency Susan Ngongi Namondo. Please give her a round of applause. Yes.
Honorable Minister, the PS for Tourism, Ministry of Tourism, all the senior government officials here, all our development partners here, IMF, World Bank, the NGOs I see in the room, the research institutions, of course, my own UN family members, and of course, I want to single out two of them. The first one is UNDP, that has been our main face as a UN to this work. But also, I would like to single out our new IFAD representative, Mohamed El Ghazi, if I'm pronouncing it right. And for the first time in a very long time, we actually have the IFAD representative based in Uganda. And I think IFAD, along with many others, has an important role to play in this topic. So for all of us, good morning again. I think we're still in the morning. On behalf of the UN system in Uganda, I'm really delighted to be part of this very important moment of reflection, the launch of this poverty status report. I start by acknowledging the leadership of the Ministry of Finance, Planning, and Economic Development and the technical and financial support of UNDP in the development of this report that is being launched today. With the multidimensional shocks impacting on different parts of the world, I want to recognize the leadership of the government of Uganda in its response to COVID-19, the impact of the war in Europe, Ebola, floods, climate change, disasters, etc. These have threatened the well-being of Ugandans and the country's progress on the implementation of the National Development Plan goals and the Sustainable Development Goals. The 2030 Agenda clearly prescribes the means of implementation and recognizes the need to improve the approach of measuring progress. And so I'm really happy that we're really introducing this multidimensional concept of poverty. So commendations to the government of Uganda for doing that. I think, Joseph, it was you who mentioned that the rate of poverty reduction has slowed. My understanding is this rate slowed before COVID. And I think this is something that we really need to interrogate because, of course, the pace of the slow of poverty reduction is important. Some of it came out of the discussion we just had, but I think that's something that needs to be interrogated further. This is the space, of course, to offer ideas. So I'm going to throw some of my own ideas in the mix of those ideas that are being offered. I think we will all agree here that with the current resources available to us, we could perhaps have better results, better development results. And one of the ideas I would like to throw is that perhaps we should also focus on tightening the gaps in institutional coordination among the various government ministries, departments, and agencies. Some of the recommendations that came out of the presentation you made, Joseph, if I'm not mistaken, really does require greater institutional collaboration. When we talk about strengthening the organizational capacity of households to be able to better engage in the commodity value chain, we need to also better strengthen the institutional capacity across board to be able to help those households. When we talk about the scale-up of access-led public investment, that also requires a cross-MDA approach. And I think that's one of those areas where the how we work could help deliver better results with current resources. Second thing is, of course, we haven't mentioned it because perhaps it was not core in this, but we haven't mentioned the effective management of public resources. That's also key. Of greater impact, of course, from taxpayer monies, but not only, the better management of these public resources would perhaps encourage more inflows of development financing, for instance, FDI, public-private partnerships, external grants, etc. So this, for me, would be a case of how to, within the current envelope that's available to us, within current resources available to us, how to achieve a little bit more, better development impact. I learned a lot also from the panel discussion. I think this has been one of the more instructive meetings I have participated in some time in the past couple of months. And I was also struck by the different programs that came up and were indicators as performing well. For instance, the social assistance grant. I think that begs for more interrogation. I know that when we talk about such social protection schemes, the issue is how do we fund them? But I think we should look at the impact and see if creatively this might be an area that we might further explore in terms of how to grow. I also really took, in terms of the Uganda Women's Entrepreneurship Program, how well it is doing. So yeah, I really learned a lot. Another thing that came out very clearly that I think is also very important, because recently we've been talking, the public debate has been focused a lot on wealth creation, which is absolutely important, of course, but also that development is absolutely critical, that it goes together, that we need those public infrastructures, we need the schools, we need the access to electricity, we need the roads, etc., to help in terms of that wealth creation. We didn't talk wealth, household size came out a little bit, but not much in the discussion, but I think also that needs to be discussed, because I think when the panel was up here, it came out a little bit in terms of, you know, what are the characteristics of today, and I think the fertility rate and things like that also needs to be factored in this discussion that we are having. Another idea that I took from this panel discussion that I think we definitely should explore, and I think Elsie, you spoke a little bit to it, is this whole idea of an ecosystem to support our businesses, especially when we talk about the informal sector, when we talk about young people, etc. That's something I think we should explore. What is that ecosystem in place to really help these businesses grow? So overall, I learned a lot. Also took from the panel discussion that we need to interrogate some of these numbers a little bit more. There are further studies we need to do. But I think these are precisely the types of discussions we need to have to help us fashion a way forward. That the situation, even as we should be proud of the progress that has been made, I think we all agree that we're not satisfied. We're not where we need to be. We need to make more progress. And I think these sorts of discussions help us in terms of thinking of what more we could do, how better we could do it. So thank you very much for this opportunity provided by the Ministry of Finance and our colleagues to be able to have these discussions. I look forward to more of these discussions. And on that happy note, of course, as the United Nations, we stand with the government of Uganda. We'll continue to support in any way we can, especially in this area of evidence generation. Thank you, UNDP, for that and the entire family. Yes, look forward to future discussions. And on that, it is my honor to welcome the Honorable Minister to address us.
Thank you so much, Susan Namondo, who is also the resident coordinator for United Nations, Madame Elsie, who presented very, very well and made my work easy this morning. We have IMF. Isabella, I've seen you. We have the PS, Minister of Tourism. We have a number of development partners, including Julius Mukunda, he's my friend now. Out of our engagements, we became friends. Julius Mukunda from the civil society, and all other development partners, not forgetting the people who I found on the panel, especially Dr. Sarah, who is the head of our EPRC, and also our staff from the Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development, led by Commissioner Joseph Enyumu. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning to you all. The topic of discussion this morning is very dear to me because it speaks to my life. I have a background of all stages. Some of you who know me, especially Choncho, Patrick, him and I know how we have risen through from all the stages. You can't believe the person addressing you. I first went to a church school where there was no structures, no nothing, no teachers. And why all that was happening is because my parents were poor. And this is the topic we are discussing this morning, how to reduce the numbers. We at Finance, Enyumu has told me, and also Elsie has emphasized it, we focus more on the income poverty. But also important to note that poverty now has become a multidimensional phenomenon. There are a number of aspects to look at when you are dealing with poverty, including the situation I was in 1988, situation where we still have people, I think, who are part of the 40%. Some of them are still going to church schools, especially where the UPE schools are distant from them. We still have these conditions in this country. Among many aspects of poverty, including the land which Sewanyana was talking about. The land is central in determining the living conditions of our people. And I want to believe from the numbers I saw and which Joseph Enyumu has presented to you this morning, Chigezi's rising numbers is largely attributed to land, the tenure system, and the subdivisions, which we call the fragmentation, vis-a-vis the rising population numbers. Someone from statistics will tell you that in South Chigezi, Kawale Chisoro area. The average numbers of people in a household, are they 7 or 8? If I am a man like me now, I want to use my father as an example. My father is there with my mother, and he produced 9 of us. So we are 11. This is the household. On average, you have about close to 8 people in every household. Living on how many, in terms of acreage, we have less than, an average is less than 2 acres for these households. I want to believe that this largely accounts for the numbers of poverty you are seeing in some regions going up. Of course, drought and other things which you have been mentioning. So these are the things UN and others, UN, us, government, and all the think tanks which are here, these are the things we must holistically look at with a view of coming up with strategies to minimize them. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you know the jobs we do are formal, and there are formalities I have to make. I therefore would like to come to my formal speech. This was just a preamble. I want to take this opportunity to thank you for choosing to attend this launch of the Poverty Status Report 2021. Today we get to know how our joint effort as stakeholders during the NDP 3 period, that is 2016-2020, impacted on the welfare of the Ugandan citizens. Your presence here today, including those participating virtually, makes you witnesses of the Uganda's commitment to a culture of evidence-based policy making. I'm sure the UN friends are happy with this, because whenever we engage with them, they emphasize evidence-based research and policy making. And you can see we are moving towards your direction as government. I also wish to thank, in a special way, our partners in this effort. The UNDP in Uganda, led by Elsie, the coordinator, for the technical and financial support extended to our ministry in the production of the report we are launching today. Thank you so much. In the same spirit, I would like to thank UBOS, Uganda Bureau of Statistics, the Economic Policy Research Center, led by Sarah, Dr. Sarah, who is over there, and our technical people at the Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development, spearheaded by Joseph Enyimu, for their collaboration in production of this report. Thank you so much. Government of Uganda, under the leadership of the National Resistance Movement political party, has made a strong case for socio-economic transformation. We are aware of the poverty reduction. We are aware that the poverty reduction is one of the key indicators of how well our socio-economic transformation agenda is performing. Government is therefore keen to ensure that both its development policies and public service delivery record are proper. From the onset of the 1990s, government has successfully championed inclusive development policies and programs aimed at reducing the evidence of poverty in Uganda. To this end, government has implemented several interventions which include, among others, the Entandikwa Poverty Eradication Action Plan, Operation Wealth Creation, the Social Assistance Grant for Empowerment, Emyoga, and the Small Scale Business Recovery Fund, of course, plus WEP, which Morris was talking about, among many other programs. As a result, the national poverty rate has been on downward trend from 56.4% in 1992-93 to 20.3% in the year 2019-2020. In financial year 2021-2022, government consolidated this strong poverty reduction record by embarking on the implementation of the parish development model. The parish development model is an expansive and inclusive initiative which, when fully implemented, will actualize the on-ground presence of the full range of public services in the 10,594 parishes of the country. This program is targeted to uplift the 39% of the households in the subsistence economy into the money economy, where livelihoods are more stable and predictable. Targeting agriculture in particular will uplift the 2.2 million households from subsistence farming and these account for 3.5 million households who are in the subsistence economy. This will in turn generate resilience amongst households to natural shocks such as climate change, related weather extremes, and the pandemics. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, at macro level, government is committed to building on the milestones that Uganda reached in financial year 2021-2022, when the country attained its NDP 2 per capita GDP target of United States dollars 1,039. Within this context, attention under NDP 3 will focus on rising productivity. This will be done by facilitating transition of a large share of the labor force to higher productive sectors and economic activities such as manufacturing. This explains the high priority government has placed on the promotion of science, technology, engineering, and innovation. I'm sure this directly feeds into what Alice was talking about in her way forward. What do we need to do to turn around the situation? So you can see also government is already thinking the way you are thinking. And I'm sure it will not be difficult for us to incorporate your proposals into our planning frameworks. However, the above efforts of government to modernize the economy need to be complemented by household efforts to live healthy and long lives. Communities need to increase uptake of the public services that the government has made available for human capital development. Key among these services is education through flagship programs such as Universal Primary Education, UPE, Universal Secondary Education, USE, primary health care and rural and urban water supply. The girl child should specifically be supported to stay longer at school in order to promote manageable family sizes, a factor that is critical for poverty reduction. Ladies and gentlemen, today's launch marks the beginning of implementation of the recommendations contained in this report. I implore all government departments, development partners, and the private sector to take keen interest in this report in order to address the underpinning causes of poverty. In doing so, we shall remain true to the spirit of the 2030 Development Agenda of Leave No One Behind. I thank you for your attention, for God and my country.
Ladies and gentlemen, another round of applause for the Honorable Minister. I want to now request the Secretary to handle. We are going to officially launch the Poverty Status Report, and we'll do it right here at the center. But as they put this together, I want to recognize a couple of people. We have, of course, the head of the SDG Secretariat here in Uganda, Dr. Albert Byamsha, who sits out of the office of the Prime Minister. Albert, thank you very much for joining us. Honorable Minister, another critical agency that is supporting government, but also directing government to focus key interventions to address issues around poverty is the National Planning Authority. And here with us is the Deputy Executive Director, Charles Ojok. I had seen Charles. Is he still here? Yes, Charles, thank you very much for joining us, because the focus for NDP3 among the many other areas is to bring more people out of poverty through the different government interventions. And Honorable Minister, sometimes we need your stories to be told. And so the story you were sharing with us about how far you have come, I know we come from almost the same village, we're next to each other. I think we need to share more of those stories. And maybe we are waiting for your book, sir, so that we can inspire more young people to become ministers. May I now take the pleasure of inviting the Honorable Minister, our Chief Guest, the RC and the RRLC, joined by, I think, Joseph. Joseph, you need to also come and officially witness the official launch of the report. Honorable Minister, it's a very nice ribbon. All you will do, please come, Honorable Minister. And yes, Joseph. Yes, and the Bureau of Statistics, please, James, you'll have to join because you are the lead aggregator of this information. So, Honorable Minister, please come. We will then have another photo after that, which will include members of the UN family. Yes, yes. Honorable Minister, it's a ribbon. So what you'll do, you'll just open the ribbon. EPRC, Dr. Sewanyana. Elsie, you'll show the minister how to open that ribbon. It's just a ribbon. Yeah, so he'll just pull the ribbon. UN family members, please come. The representatives of the UN, I think Patricia, you also should be here from UN Women. Honorable Minister, you'll unveil, you'll just pull it's like the shoeless. It's like our shoeless. So we'll officially open. There you go. Round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. And then we'll unveil for you. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the official launch of the Poverty Status Report 2021 by the Honorable Minister of Finance, the Honorable Henry Musasizi. We'll need the markers. Veronica, do we have the marker? Yes, Honorable Minister. Honorable Minister, you'll now put your signature, Honorable Minister, on the report. Honorable Minister, they give you a pen. There you go, marker. To officially signify the commissioning and launching of this status report 2021. If you're watching us online and on television, you can actually access this report on the UNDP website. But also if you go onto the social media platforms at UNDP Uganda, you will be able to find a link to the report, and you will also find key highlights from the presentation by Joseph Enyimu, the Ministry of Finance, and also follow the conversation on the social media platforms. We are using the hashtag Poverty Status Report. You will follow the conversation and also a link to the live YouTube link where we are sharing the entire event. We want to, in a special way, thank the Ministry of Finance and, of course, the Minister himself and the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Finance who were part of this launch and have been of significant support to development of this report supported by the UNDP. And so we'll have our representatives and stakeholders do the same, and then we'll have a photo moment. I'll ask Dr. Albert if you can also come, because you're the head of the SDG Secretariat. And this particular SDG number 1 is what we are speaking to. But also, he did make me aware of the fact that 12 of the SDGs really speak to this SDG, this particular SDG. And when you speak to the theme of our report, a lot of the other SDGs actually speak to the theme that we have that includes jobs and informality, so the questions around the industrialization and also inclusion. So we'll now have a photo moment. Cameraman, where do you want them to come up? I'm happy to bring them up. Cameraman, you want them up? All right. The Ministry of Finance can guide us. I see there's a lead cameraman in the ministry. LC and the RC, if we can have go on either side of the board. There you go. Richard, yes. And the report. Perfect. There you go. Richard, thanks for letting us the report. I see the RR has a report. Excellent. There you go. On either side, if we could have some of the, there you go. So cameraman, you will go to the back so we can have everyone in the picture. Albert, also closer. There you go. So cameraman, please ensure everyone appears in this photo. For accountability purposes, I need to know that every stakeholder was involved in this and is involved in dissemination of this report, the 2021 Poverty Status Report, today officially launched by the Ministry of Finance and the UNDP. So ladies and gentlemen, may we once again put our hands together for the official launch of this report. Honorable Minister, we want to thank you for joining us this morning. And I'll request our Secretariat to move the board and place it again on the side and invite Richard and his team. Richard, we still have another 45 minutes. That 45 minutes, Richard, includes a plenary session where you will take questions from the audience. So I want to invite the panelists back, including Jacob. And Richard, now you'll stand like me and ask all the questions from the podium. So Jacob, if you could come with all the other panelists, please come back. Jacob Eyeru is from the National Youth Council. He's the chair of the Youth Council. And all the other panelists, please come. Tom, Dr. Sarah, James, Richard, please come and invite the entire team. And Mr. Olgembe.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, as the minister shakes hands with all of us, let's reconvene our panel so that we can do the last part of this discussion. Now, this is going to be the chance to hear back from most of you who are in the audience. If you have a question for these panelists. The panelists said very many. So it's now time to listen to them and we hear, to listen to all of you and we hear what you have to say. But before I open the plenary discussion, Jacob, you are here. Are you here in full color? Since you are a young man, I hear that means something. Jacob, the report has some very interesting statistics, but one which I want to pick out is around young people and the youth and the issues around poverty and young people. One of the statistics, worrying statistics in this report is that nearly 57.1% of the youth have failed to move out of poverty. Now, that is worrying because when we look at the population dynamic in this country, the population distribution in this country, we know that it's mostly young people. But if we are to start at that point, and any other points you have about this report, what are the few insights you want to share with us?
Okay, thank you. Very good morning, everyone. Firstly, please accept my apologies. I should have been here much earlier, except that I confirmed the date and venue at 9 a.m. today. So that's very unfortunate, but I'm glad that this conversation is very important. And much more than just being here, I am glad that the young people of this country have a chance to speak to this report, given our demographics as a country. So when I looked at this report, and like you've said, I was looking out for how much, in terms of how we have a conversation about poverty, do we look at it from the demographic reality of the country? That was my first assessment. When the conversation on poverty levels is ensuing, how much do we focus on the disparities between the age classification? And I was very happy to note with this report that there is now hopefully a trend that looks at young people and young people with poverty as a critical part of the conversation on poverty levels. So about two things that I found. One was where do we locate young people? And very many times, the age group that young people fall into, if they are very experienced in the job sector or any sort of employment, we're talking about no more than 5 years of job experience. But most of the young people considered in the adult age and within the young people bracket, at least for our country of 30 and below, we are talking about people who are supposed to ideally be within higher education, okay? But even before that, we are still talking about people who should be in some form of education. I am glad that this report noted the inverse relationship between the attained level of education and the extent of poverty. The inverse relationship is very clear. The more educated a population, the lesser their poverty rates. It's even more consistent with specialized education, where you're talking about a skilled individual who has a mastery of anything, or some semi-mastery of anything. It means that the more young people we get to be educated in a special manner, but also completing education, are able then to translate into a conversation of reducing poverty. So I looked at how we've been playing out, how the country needs to move forward. Let's start with access to a higher education in this country. The enrollment rate, not completion, enrollment rate for higher education in this country is at 5% of people who should have enrolled by that enrollment year. The way we can address that, which then plays into what we're trying to do with poverty, would be through mass enrollment at higher education. How you achieve that is probably not by a universal education at higher education level, because we probably can't afford that. But we have some best practices from our neighbors. By 2004, Kenya was already sending up to 39,000 young people to school on a loan basis. This achieved two things. The first is that this young person knows that their creativity must be sustained even after education to be able to pay back this loan. And so there's an incentive to become economically, in terms of the economy itself and paying back, there's an incentive to be economically productive within an economy. But our country's uptake for higher education, which would speak to specialized education, is at 5% of enrollment. Worse than that, our universal idea of the loan scheme has supported up to now just over 5,000 young people. And so when you compare that with the inverse relationship that education has on the poverty level, I think the answer is plain for everyone to see. We need to invest more in how many people are able to attend education so we can have less poverty affecting our people. The second point that I felt was very, for me, very disturbing was the extent to which the report analyzed the impact of age-specific interventions and generally special interest-specific interventions. And here I'm talking about classifications of women, classifications of persons with disability, and classifications of young people. In this report, we have basically about a page that speaks to the impact of interventions around that. But that actually has been the blueprint of attempting to have redress on the conversation on poverty in this country. The Uganda Women Empowerment Program, the Youth Livelihood Program, the Youth Venture Capital Fund, and now the other special purpose vehicles that we have in Emyoga and the new parish development model. Even in the latest, the parish development model, the conversation is still on how are we impacting these clear categories of our society. I feel very strongly that we need to assess more what the impact of this is on the economy in terms of how productive is it and how much are we learning from the errors we're making. I'll give an example. In the Youth Livelihood Program, we have impacted close to 144,000 young people. Statistically, 144,000 is a good number. But 144,000 from 9.5 million young people in that age group is statistically almost insignificant. If you want to have a good say on impact statistically on a population, you should talk north of 10%. And that is not talking north of 10%. We are just somewhere around 2% of that population group. So I feel that the report could look at the statistical, in the future, we could talk about the statistical impact of what we are trying to address with these special purpose vehicles. But if we talk to the future now, in terms of the parish development model, again, statistically, the parish development model will be the most funded program in our country's history. It will impact the highest number of communities. And we're talking about, if we are to keep the talk on paper, we are talking about the most underprivileged in our societies, the rural, the unbanked. We are talking for the inverse relationship of financial inclusion. We're talking about that very population that we want to reach. And so what Madame Elsie said here is very important. How do we ensure that such a program meets the intended goal? And if we can work together, the National Youth Council is very willing, the Ministry of Finance, to ensure that these programs that have high impact on poverty reduction are done, if they are the only perfect thing in this country, they are done well, have no stories of corruption, have no stories of failure in the process flow, and even if that's the only thing that works perfectly in this country, will go a long way in poverty reduction. In conclusion, therefore, we could be far better, but we are here, for me, because of strategic structural challenges within our approach mechanisms. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jacob. Jacob is a young person. I just wanted to confirm that. He has spoken also very well. We also want to congratulate him on that. So those are two important factors that I want to come out. But I want to open up to, before we come back to hear from the panel, to open up to all of you and see if you have any comments and reactions on this report. I think there is a paragraph in this report that we need to really interrogate. I don't see Dr. Byamjisha. He is supposed to be here because it says that all forms of poverty may not end as soon as envisioned in the SDG 1. And I think we must do something more because this is 2023. We are left with 7 years to 2030. And our commitment was to make sure that we do quite a bit about poverty. So I haven't seen him, but when he comes back, he will answer that question. But I am opening up the floor, and there are microphones, I think, which are available, and people will be sharing those microphones. Who has the microphones? Can you put up your hand if you have a microphone? Can you come on this side? So that we have a fair distribution of people with microphones. We will start on this side. I can see one hand here. I think this is Julius. There is a hand on the second table. We shall just go a little bit, and then here in the middle. But we'll start here on this first table. Microphone, you need to get running shoes, since this is a big room. Thank you very much. Yes, Julius.
Yes. Thanks, Richard. Again, to congratulate the team from finance for this, and I think it's just going to give us ideas on how we can, again, from a civil society perspective, on how to engage government on some of these key issues. I have only 3 takeaways. One is that we don't need rocket science to address poverty. Mm-hmm. And I think it has come out very, very clearly that the things we need to do, we have the capacity to do them as a government. And therefore, I'm looking forward for one, in terms of, and I think the UN resident coordinator said it, in terms of reducing duplication of government programs. When you have MYOGA, WEP, Youth Livelihood Program, Agricultural Credit Facility, SMAC Fund, Youth Venture Capital, and now we have added the parish development model. All of these are taking money. In which way can we make sure that they can actually either be consolidated, but to target the right people and the right individuals, and that they can be effective. The second one, I think, for me is on resource management. I mean, when you read the Auditor General's report that was released recently in Parliament, it tells you how we are really very good at not spending money in the right way. To the extent that
Why are you calling it not good at it? Why don't you say?
To the extent that if we could actually be very prudent in managing our resources, we would know the amount of money we have is enough, and is enough to invest and get out of this poverty. Lastly, for me, is where else should we spend money? I think we are very stubborn on that as a government, because the evidence is very clear that if we invest well in agriculture, Richard, it can be a game changer. But if you start spending far, far less than what is expected, then what else do you want to be done? And I think that's where my point is, that let us only spend most of our resources where poverty can be reduced very quickly. I thank you.
Right, thank you. The person on the next table, and then, yes, the table just behind you, and then we shall come here in the middle.
Thank you very much. My name is Peter Rasmussen. I'm the country economist from the African Development Bank. I think this was a very interesting report and very well done by the team. One of the things that I was missing a little bit in the analysis was more on the jobs and the actual sectors. Where is poverty in the different sectors? I think at the broad level, we know agriculture is a key area where poverty is ripe and is a driver of vulnerability. So where I would like to go is, we've been focusing on agriculture for the last 30 years. We've been focusing on agriculture for the past 30 years. And the fact is that productivity has not raised in that sector at all. So if you're not increasing productivity, you're not increasing incomes, and therefore you're keeping people in poverty. So my question is it time to think about supporting more, I didn't catch the name of the young gentleman in the middle, supporting more these programs that actually can increase industrialization, increasing a shift in the movement of jobs from low productivity agriculture into high productivity industries like manufacturing, construction, renewable energy, those sectors, as well as some of the service sectors where the productivity is a lot higher and where incomes are in fact 4, 5, 6, 7 times higher than they are in agriculture. So my question is, how can we do more to actually perhaps, rather than focus on agriculture, but focus on the higher sectors where productivity is higher and incomes are higher? Thank you.
Thank you. There are 2 hands there. Okay, both of you will speak, but for a short time. Jan is my professor, so I can't say no. Okay.
Thank you very much. My name is Moses Mando Kondo. I'm Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities representative in West Nile with the recognition from UNDP. I would like to present this request to Acting Commissioner, Mr. Joseph Enyimu, after his presentation. First, to consider environmental degradation issues as a barrier or as drivers to accelerate poverty. In northern Uganda, environmental degradation is a new battle after Lord's resistance insurgency. Put in mind that environmental degradation and agriculture do not go together, because young people are not directly involved in depleting forest covers, but restoring forest covers, reversing land degradation, and sustainably using natural resources really hinder our people. So my request is this. As indigenous people's representative, we have come out openly to identify International Land Degradation Day, which is commemorated or celebrated on the 3rd of August of the year, to raise the banner about the issues that affect our local people, inclusiveness of refugees living with us. So this is my kind request, and Mrs. LSC is here. Her Excellency is here. This is my cry that should we integrate International Land Degradation Day into national activities so that we can push poverty out of Uganda and globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Give to your neighbor. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Irisa Ocheng, a retired teacher. Now, in measuring poverty, there are two factors: income and population. I feel that the population side has been ignored in this report, because we can actually reduce poverty by reducing population growth. The other day, I saw a man in a newspaper. He had 102 children with, I think, 2 acres of land. The second thing I want to put across is we seem to be hiding in averages. Average income, average everything. These averages hide many things. For example, income has been increasing, but for a few people. Most people, the incomes have reduced. So if the average poverty has reduced, doesn't mean that the absolute number has reduced. In fact, the director of EPRC mentioned that absolute numbers have increased. So I am recommending that the population side should be considered. And secondly, we should not hide in averages. We should come with absolute numbers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. He said he's a retired teacher, but he's a retired professor. So he needs to declare fully that he's an economist in his own right. But can we also, we have had some really nice and interesting discussions now. That one on population, the other one is on averages versus absolutes. And my panel, you better take down what you want to come back to. And I think we also had the issue around agricultural productivity and jobs, how we can shift that. And then, of course, Julius told us something about prudence. So we'll take a few more points. There are too many men talking, so that in itself is a danger. It's not my eyes, but if there is any woman who put up her hand and I didn't see her, then I'm not doing my job. I'll take the one here. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. My name is Adela. I'm an energy economist. The theme is jobs, informality, and poverty in Uganda. And the results or the statistics were pointing at informality, increasing poverty levels. I would like to request the people who prepared the statistics to kindly point out what are those sectors where there's a lot of informality and what can we do to address them, because if we just put it out there, informality is increasing poverty, fine. But now, for starters, where do we start? Where do we start? Then there was, the results point out that there are about 137 districts that didn't realize the NDP 2 targets. Now, I'm asking myself, Are we being too ambitious as a country, setting targets we can't achieve? I mean, where are the gaps? Why didn't we achieve those targets? And what's the way forward for NDP3? Because that is likely to happen for NDP3. And does it make sense to move to NDP3 when NDP2 targets are not achieved? I submit.
Thank you. Very pointed questions that we have. On the next table, was that a lady on the next table? Yes. We want to continue the distribution so that it's 5 speakers this side, 5 speakers. Okay. Yes,
Yeah.
please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm Nawide Pauline from the National Association of Women's Organization in Uganda. My concern is on page 40, gender and poverty dynamics. We realize that when you read the report, you realize that 60.66% women remained poor between 2013 and 2014. Then it's 46.6 men remained poor. Now my question is, what are the strategies put in place to see that the gender disparities are addressed? And actually, she has just talked about the informalities, and most of the categories of people in the informalities are the women and the girls. What are we doing to see that there is that equality and poverty is reduced among the women? Then my second question is, what has caused the stagnation and what are we going to do? That one I think will go to the World Bank panelists, because there is a reduction in growth and a decrease in poverty, but we are stagnant. What has caused that and what should we do to see that we grow? Thank you.
Okay, I think they think that the World Bank answers all the hard questions. So just, but we'll see who else wants to speak to that. Are there any other people on this side before I come back this way?
I'm here.
Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Isabella Karpovic. I'm the representative of the International Monetary Fund. I browsed through the report. Congratulations, very interesting piece. What I found really striking in the report is that we are used to seeing inequality as a byproduct of growth and development. And here we're seeing inequality rising with lower growth. And that's particularly painful because when we grow, then everybody shows everybody shares in the fruits of that growth. Where I think that we have more work to do is to understand how to prioritize government interventions, both at the macro level and at the level of the single programs. So in a country where between 15 and 20% of the population in each income group is poor, the question is, what is really the right way of fighting the poverty? Is it social protection or is it growth? And how do we get there? We've seen that some of the social assistance programs have contributed to eliminating part of the poverty. But the question is, what is the bang for the buck? Which is, how are the scarce resources best spent to exit this very difficult status? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope the IMF is not asking the World Bank this question, but anybody else will have to also deal with that question. We'll take 2 more and then we come back to the panel. There are a couple of hands. Yeah, the lady here and then the 2 people on the... Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Elizabeth. I'm an economist and research fellow. I work with Accord. Thank you so much for this report. While I was following Joseph's presentation, I got to appreciate the 10 conclusions coupled with the 10 recommendations that he made. My concern is, where is the economic inclusion? What are the particular aspirations to leave no one behind in terms of the youth, women, people living with disabilities, and the elderly? While we all desire for the poverty numbers to go down, are there intended aspirations for our economy to also grow inclusively? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have two people on the next table. Yes, and then
Thank
we'll
you,
come back to the panel.
Mr. Moderator. My name is Prosper Ahabge, and I'm from Makerere University. I'm interested in taking you through to page 21, particularly table 2.9, which shows the poverty rate by sector of employment and COVID-19, mainly comparing agriculture in terms of crop and non-crop, industry and trade. When you look at this table, you find that crop agriculture has the highest rate of poverty before COVID-19 and even during COVID-19. Even in reality, when you go back, you find that the rate of agricultural production is well lacking. I don't know whether we need to venture into intense agricultural industrialization, because the attempted mechanization by supplying tractors somehow to fertilizers to a few agricultural wall-off has failed to industrialize the agriculture sector. Perhaps we need to embark on agro-processing and increase the productivity per square mile of land or per acre of land. In that case, we look at things like interventions like Emyoga Fund to boost capital. While this Emyoga Fund would be a good venture, there is a problem that the efforts might be futile because it is not properly institutionalized. And having a non-institutionalized intervention mechanism is one of the fatal attempts to end poverty. Like, it will not give the productivity per the funds invested in. Lastly, the question that we should look at is...
Before you leave, you
yes.
have said something very dangerous.
Yes.
When you say Myoga is not properly institutionalized, what do you mean?
Yes, it lacks the proper policies and systems which have a definite way of how that Emyoga Fund is running in supplementing capital on the low scale, on the village or local scale. And lastly, the recent statistics show that Uganda has attained 70%, almost attained 70% adult literacy. So you find that this question of education, maybe we can discuss the content but not the numbers of the literacy rates. Then why are we still languishing in poverty, even in the event of literacy and developing infrastructure? There is a problem that needs to be addressed, which I may point out to be on the issue of capital and the institutions.
Okay.
I beg submit.
Thank you. There were a couple. Okay, yes, your neighbor and then the gentleman here, his hand has been shooting up aggressively for a number of times, so I'll take him. And Dr. Byamjisha will answer my question, which I asked him. If he doesn't know, I'll ask it again. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Mr. Moderator. My question specifically goes to Mr. Jacob Boyeru. The government has tried to bring youth programs like the Youth Livelihood Program and other programs, UWEPU, but we have seen nothing much is being done on the ground. We are talking about poverty, but poverty is continuing to be a very serious problem for our country. So, a question here comes. Mr. Jacob Boyeru is the chairperson, National Youth Council. But where the problem comes from, our youth, like on the LC1, back in the villages, are not involved. And Mr. Jacob Boyeru, what specifically have you done to engage the local people from LC1, especially the youth, who voted you? Because I know the process that got you where you reached started from the LC1. What have you done as the National Youth Council to empower these young people to see that they come the poverty levels, they access education, and they get to know what really it means? The National Council needs to do a lot, specifically to inform the youth back in our villages. Thank you.
Okay, that's an accountability question for Jacob. You will answer it at some point. Yes, please, and then Dr. Byamjisha will answer our question. I will ask it.
Thank you very much. Mine is areas for further research to appreciate the emerging dynamics. For example, today, road accidents, and especially border is across the country and is occupying the most sensitive and productive population, and that's the young people. But we've seen a number of deaths, and these people leave young babies, young children, young women. How much is this impacting in increasing poverty? Because these families directly move to poverty. Cost of doing business is increasing every day. One, if I can single out, is just road traffic. The expenditure on fuel, time wastage and frustration. How much is that impacting to a country as poverty? And then elaborating more on population. We are from COVID, and a number of young people were wasted into teenage pregnancy. And this is the future for this country. How much is that impacting on poverty? These many young mothers carrying babies, surprisingly, they are now having the second child, and yet they were supposed to be in school. How much is that?
Thank you.
And finally, agriculture is the backbone. And if we want to change, but the cost of doing agriculture needs to be evaluated. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for those areas of further research. Dr. Byamjisha, we asked you the question that if you go to page 95 of the Poverty Status Report, it says that all forms of poverty may not end as soon as envisioned in the SDG 1. You don't even have to read it, you just have to hear from me. And they say that the high multidimensional rate of 42.1% shows that we are less likely to achieve this SDG. So since you are in charge of the SDG Secretariat, you'll have to tell us what we need to do in the next 7 years. How many years are left? This is 7 years. And what is it that government is focusing on? Thank you.
Thank you very much, our moderator. That is true, of course. We are remaining with 7 years to 2030, when we are supposed to have eliminated poverty in all countries, including Uganda. But this cannot be possible, as we have noticed from the results from the study. First of all, we are happy that we have results now, which have provided evidence that for government now to take action. So in our program of action, we are noted that a number of people from different regions are poor. And of course, we shall be advising government, especially now that we are coming to the planning stage, since finance is going to send the second budget call actually next week. And this week, the president set up a presidential advisory committee on the budget to prioritize, to go back and prioritize the priorities which had been set by government. And from what I have noted now, is that at least we have evidence to advise government on what to do. So we cannot achieve the poverty. Of course, we cannot achieve that target, but at least we must work hard to reduce it by looking at key accelerators which have been mentioned. So to me, yes, we can't achieve, but we are on the way to achieve it because we must work together. And I'm grateful that the Ministry of Finance worked with the development partners, especially UNDP, to come up with this study, which we have been waiting for. So we are going to make sure that we use the results to advise key different stakeholders so that we can reduce the poverty levels in this country.
Good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Dr. Byamjisha, I wanted to throw that in because I think it's an important discussion. But now we have only about a minute for each one of you. That is 6 minutes. And when you have 1 minute, you just give us your pitch and tell us what you take out of the discussion. There are several issues that have been touched on, but I think for Mr. Walugembe, why don't you speak to the question around jobs and productivity? Because I think that was an interesting dynamic. And then we shall ask Tom to prepare to say something, that focuses on this question of inequality again, and how we can deal with that. But if you can also, I don't know if there is any other analysis you have seen on population and poverty that you may want to share with us, and then we shall move on. But please go ahead.
Okay. First, I want to thank the gentleman from the African Development Bank who mentioned this dynamic around agriculture. And you are right. I've spent 20 years in this forum, and every year we keep saying agriculture is the backbone, agriculture is the backbone. Meanwhile, productivity is decreasing, contribution to GDP is decreasing. Why do we keep doing the same things and expect different results? So I would want to suggest, let's go back to the recommendation of the Poverty Status Report of 2014, which says we need to focus on agro-processing. And when we talk about commercialization, let's not think about investors and all these people. Smallholders are the best, and we need to work with smallholders. We need to secure their land tenure system. We need to equip them with skills to add value. We need to link them to markets through clustering. And that's why we talk about access to markets like the Africa Continental Free Trade Area that Madam Elsie has mentioned. Because this is critical. If we don't take advantage of these markets to ensure that our Ugandans are able to sell these things through clustering and aggregation, then we won't move far. Now, the other point I had was, how are we because now, this thing has taken about 8 years to do the second report. And then in the middle, we had COVID-19. So I would want to know, if we removed COVID-19, how would we have performed? Because that would also, we can say, okay, maybe some of this poor performance is due to COVID, but in the absence of COVID, were we on track or not? So maybe, Mr. Joseph, that's something you want to explore further. And then, just to confirm, someone talked about informality, sectoral spread of informality. And it's clear that mining and quarrying has a lot of informality, followed by agriculture, construction, trade, manufacturing. And then you also see that the poverty incidences in rural areas is greater than poverty incidences in urban areas. So it means we need to look at how do we ensure that we urbanize our people, because that, I don't know whether it's a correct approach, but it appears a correlation between urbanization and, poverty reduction. And then also the movement between sectors. How do we ensure that people move up the value chain from farmers to industry and so on? Thank you.
Thank you very much. If we had time, I would take you on the issue of urbanization, but we shall do that at lunchtime. It won't cause indigestion, but it will be a discussion for us to do it very well. Tom, from what you've heard and what I've asked you, what are some of your thoughts?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to be very brief. So, inequality. When we look at changes in poverty can only be due to two factors, broadly. Changes in growth, changes in inequality. So we know from the report that inequality in Uganda hasn't changed. It stayed same. So that means that the fact that there has been very little poverty reduction is due to changes in growth, because inequality didn't change. So growth slowed down, and that explains the slowdown of poverty reduction, given that inequality remained the same. So the key question becomes, why did growth slow down? And that is something that my colleagues from the World Bank or my colleague from the IMF can speak more about and better than I can. Second, population and poverty. Of course, population can be kind of an inhibitor to poverty reduction. So population growth by itself is not a problem. It only becomes a problem if it's happening in an environment that doesn't create enough productive opportunities for this greatly expanding population. So if Uganda is able to create lots of jobs, create lots of income earning opportunities, population growth by itself is not an issue. However, if the country cannot do this, then of course it becomes a key issue. So we know that larger households are more likely to be poor. We know that there's a big youth bulge coming on in Uganda and also in many countries in the region. So population growth and effective policy to kind of guide population growth, which relates to female education mainly, will be very important. So let me stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. That's helpful. Sarah, do you want to say something?
Yes.
There are a couple of things. There is this issue of numbers, which Professor Cheng has talked about, absolutes versus averages. It's only you who can speak to such issues, because we don't even know what she was saying. And then there was also the issues around some of the disparities that we are seeing, which were mentioned, especially to do with the gender disparities. I don't know if in the statistics you are seeing anything, but please go ahead.
Thank you so much, moderator. And I wanted to pose my own question. Response, sorry.
Oh, you are response.
I wanted to go back to the poverty trends. So before the NDP, the rate of poverty reduction was faster than when we are in the NDP period. And I think one of the reasons during the NDP, we focused so much on infrastructure and so on, and maybe less on the social sector. So to me, I think we need to be able to see how best can we balance our investment between infrastructure as well as social spending. The other one has to do with agriculture. ADB senior economist, I totally disagree with you. And I think we need to do proper diagnosis of what is happening. When you look at the agricultural sector, you talked about the last 20 years, and also my colleague has talked about 80 years where they talk about agriculture. If you go back to the NDP, we are trying to emphasize agro-industrialization. And when you talk about agro-industrialization, you are talking about industrializing agriculture. Are we there? Yeah. Okay? We are talking about industrializing agriculture. You cannot industrialize agriculture without really working on the foundation, on the production side. Okay? We need to work on the production side. And when you look at some of the interventions that government has been doing, you cannot go to a farmer and you give extension services and you think that productivity is going to go up. Farmers need a full package, okay? They need a full package, not these piecemeal packages like let's distribute seeds and so on. That one will not work, okay? They need a full package and it has to be of scale, okay? So that you can have a very strong production base. Once you have that strong production base, then you can go into your industrialization and so on. That way people will be shifting automatically from the agricultural sector to the other side. But you cannot talk about agro-processing without really working on the production side. So to me, I think I can also come back to ADB. We do really appreciate the investment in markets and so on, because when you walk along the roads, you see so many markets that have been built through the monies you get from ADB. But that was wasted investment, because we have not really worked on the production side. So I totally agree, I totally believe that we need to address the issues in the agricultural sector, and we address them in a coherent manner, not in a piecemeal manner, then we shall be able to get where we want to be.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
That is Sarah. She always puts out things the way she sees them. So should we go back to the plan for modernization of agriculture, which was many years ago, which had all these pillars and whatever, or something of that nature that is more comprehensive? Maybe that's the way to go. So, Jacob, somebody asked you to account for your time at the National Youth Council, but I didn't bring you here to make accountability. You'll convene your own meeting to deal with that issue of how you deal with young people. But from the issues that you have heard discussed here, what are you taking away as a key point of reflection?
Thank you, Richard. And it's interesting. I purpose to respond to Peter from the African Development Bank because his response was directly brought up against my observation. But I think there's been able response to that. And I think that the response generally is along the value chain of how we do agriculture in the country. Agriculture's potential to absorb the job necessity in this country is boundless. The challenge is the value chain proposition that government is working on, but also how much that value chain comes down to what UNDP has been talking about, the governance of things, having accelerator infrastructure. How do we penetrate agriculture with ICT and have intersectionality among sectors that then shows what everyone can feed into so everyone can get something from it? How do we increase access to markets through increasing access to internet? Where I come from in Kamuda, somewhere in Soroti district, I don't have a conversation on internet there because there is no school that talks about internet, but that is almost urban population, just outside, about 5 kilometers out of town. So I hope that that can be forwarded. But I think I should speak about my mandate, even if it's not accountability. What have we done? My brother, there are two challenges. One, when we came into the National Youth Council, this is our second year, we found that it's a very centralized system where we work at the national level, approach people at the national level, and do not disseminate. What we changed first was to decentralize that. And now we're being able to give capacity at the lower level to do their own monitoring. Why that is important is because unless the young people's force is tangible at the local government level, our voices at the national level don't have so much an effect. The same sits with government and decentralization. And so even for all special interest groups, unless you're presently active at where the rubber meets the road, at the village, at the parish level, you're not able to actually do anything. But secondly, we've ensured that government interventions do not forsake young people. What you're seeing in the parish development model is the work of the National Youth Council. Having the special interest groups represented at the parish committees is actually the National Youth Council's push work. The women benefited, the persons with disabilities benefited, but that's our work. Having quotas in that money to meet special interest capacity was the work of the National Youth Council. And so this is at policy level, but for that policy level to be implemented at the ground level, you need that structural capacity. How do you finance lower structures, but also how do you communicate to them? And I'm glad you gave one of the solutions, intensifying our engagement and communication capacity, which unfortunately is a budget issue. But we're working with partnerships to make sure that is better capacitated. But I hope decentralization starts it. We've now committed 30% of our annual budget to decentralized structure. So I don't touch that money. It goes directly to the district level, but it's far insufficient. And we're hoping that ministers and Mr. Inyimu here can understand the need when we talk to them over the next 2 weeks. Thank you so much.
Okay, good. You have said many good things around what young people, and the good thing, they are listening to you both on YouTube and also here. So I'm sure they'll be coming back to you on some of those issues. But one of the other things we have to talk about here is really about social protection, because our colleague Patrick is doing that at Parliament. And as you heard, there was a discussion from the floor around which way to go. Should we go the social protection way, the growth way? How do we deal with these issues of poverty? But what is the thinking at Parliament in terms of how they can be supportive to deal with these issues of poverty from a social protection perspective?
As part of my reflection on this report, is an issue that points to the positive developments that have happened in the social protection space over the last 10 years. About 10 years ago, it was very difficult to convince anybody that social protection was a tool for dealing with poverty. In fact, up to now, many people still view social protection spending as consumptive. I'm glad that reports such as these continuously highlight that social protection interventions are very critical in reducing the poverty levels for countries such as Uganda. So we look at social protection in many lenses. We are looking at social protection on the side of the social security element. We have been talking about informality here. When you look at people in the informal sector, they are not covered under social protection interventions that we have. The NNSSF, for example, has less than 2 million people who are currently members, and the issue of whether they are active or not is a debate for another day. When you look at the coverage for those that fall under social assistance, you realize that the older persons that are being targeted here currently are less than 400,000. The children that are being targeted are not very many. So we still have social protection programs that are scattered all over the place, that are poorly funded. What can Parliament do about this? Number one, Parliament can be what I call a gatekeeper to ensure, to open doors for social protection debates to come in there. So as you realize recently, the budget for SAGE, for example, for next financial year, which was at 121 billion, in the National Budget Framework paper was cut by 80%, and only 24 billion was reflected. It had to take the intervention of members of Parliament and many other stakeholders to call on Ministry of Finance to revisit the idea of cutting across board the subvention budgets by 80%. And I'm sure that in the coming ministerial policy statement, that issue will be rectified. That would be one role that would be played by Parliament to ensure that resources are allocated to critical projects in the social protection area. The other issue is, of course, to demand for review of policies. The current social protection policy that we have of 2015 right now, I think, has been overtaken by events. It's high time that we talked about the review. We still don't have the National Social Protection Strategy. As I understand, the National Social Protection Strategy is still in draft. It is something that we need. We can't be praising social protection as a very effective tool, but again, as a country, we don't have a national strategy. It means then that even if we actually fund, we continue to fund things that are not moving in a systematic way. We need also to invest, and this is an issue that our technocrats and members of Parliament should focus on. Registry, social registry. Some people call it a single registry. You realize that during COVID, there are many interventions that were put up, including direct cash transfers to vulnerable persons. But which people actually got these funds? It is perhaps one who had a mobile phone. Most of the vulnerable people don't have mobile phones. It is perhaps those who are registered under NERA. Some vulnerable persons are too vulnerable to actually be even registered under NERA. So you don't have a register, you don't know who is vulnerable and who is not. So that is an area that we could also invest in, also investing in registration of persons. You realize that, for example, under the SAGE program, 43,000 persons.
Patrick, you are going too fast. And I wanted to ask a simple question. Are you saying that these things you are taking forward? Because I don't want us to give, since you are from the social protection group that is doing advocacy, are there things that are happening at Parliament that we can latch on and say, this is what is going on?
What is going on is that pushing for full financing of SAGE is going on, and it is something that we call on everybody to support. Full financing for NERA to ensure that all vulnerable persons are enrolled is very critical because, like I mentioned, you have 43,000 older persons who are eligible but cannot benefit because of the national identity card. Then we also have the issue of persons with disabilities, the budget is low, and we're pushing for its funding. And we're also advocating for the child-sensitive social protection programs to be scaled across the country. So we need to be informed, of course, by support from other stakeholders. Research, this is going to be a very useful tool for advocacy as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. I think that's very, very helpful. Now, there was a question from the participants on Zoom, and I think, James, you will have to answer it, or you will have to find an answer. So one of the two options. They're asking, it looks like reading through this report, it's not clear if there is any analysis that is done around vulnerable groups, especially refugees and all those other kinds of vulnerable groups. But from your understanding of the analysis, what do you know?
Thank you.
But
the report.
You are concluding. Yeah.
Okay, refugees are also part of the vulnerable groups. And when one looks at the different vulnerable populations in the country, I think what it comes to is that, to me, what I see is that we need a lot of data, a lot of evidence to monitor all these interventions, these different vulnerable groups. The report may not be probably specific on refugees, but it broadly touches the vulnerable categories. But aside, we have done a number of studies specifically on refugees, and even recently we have just finished data collection looking at reproductive health issues under the demographic survey in the refugee settlement. So there is evidence that we can give in case the report doesn't provide sufficient areas for vulnerable groups. Related to that is really what I would sum up to say that, there are different vulnerable groups. And if we are to leave no one behind, we need to make sure that we account for all of them. But we can only do that if we have good data. And good data is expensive. And so it's not a one-off that you do it this year and wait for 5 years. It needs to be sustained. And so we need to invest in some of these to be able to tell a story and be able to track and identify the bottlenecks that will help us to lift these people out of that category of vulnerability. And maybe the other bit is, and from the discussion, what I see is, which also Dr. Sawanyara talked about and colleagues here, there are very good interventions, probably more or less targeting the same audience. There is a bit of overlap in terms of who they are targeting. But to what extent are these linked to be able to identify the total effect that these multiple interventions are contributing to the beneficiaries? So maybe, as Sarah put it, we need a package, but also for those that are existing, perhaps I think, what if we actually try to look up, for instance, those who are benefiting from SAGE, okay, as beneficiaries, which other program are they benefiting from? Or within that community, which opportunities exist that local leaders can help them to actually tap into? So that kind of linkage probably also need to explore where it doesn't exist. I thank you.
Thank you, James. Thank you very much to all the panelists. Please give them a very big hand clap. Thank you for giving us those insights. There are questions that were posed and proposals that will go to Joseph. I don't know at what point you will speak, but there is one here. People want you to do more research. Somebody is asking about the contribution of infrastructure to poverty reduction, that you've had a huge investment in poverty in infrastructure as government. Have you done a study in this, or is this something to study? So that's one that has been said. And then somebody was asking, is the Ministry of Finance doing studies every year to inform the budget? So again, you'll have to tell us, because at least from my knowledge, I know that something has been going on. And of course, there are the other 3 areas they asked you to work on: road accidents and poverty, cost of doing business, including traffic, and how much that is causing even much more vulnerability for people, and the issue around teenage pregnancy. I think the teenage pregnancy, UNFPA has just released the report. I was part of the people who did that work on teenage pregnancy and within this context of the COVID and recovery. Maybe when they have it out, you'll also look. But clearly there is a severe issue that we have to deal with as a country. But ladies and gentlemen, with that, we want to sign off and give this back to Maurice to continue with the ushering us to the next level, which is lunch.
Ladies and gentlemen, another round of applause for our panel, who are allowed to go and take their seats. Thank you very much, Richard, for ably moderating this session. We want to appreciate the panelists, Dr. Sarah Sewanyana. Round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. Let's be courteous. Mr. John Walugembe, Jacob Eyeru, James Mwonge, Patrick Chichoncho Katabazi, and Mr. Tom Bandervoigt. I hope I really haven't muddled your name, Tom. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for this very insightful panel. I think that a couple of issues have been raised, and I actually liked some of the key highlights from the comments shared in the room. And I think there is an interest, especially one on the data from 2020 to 2022. I think it would be very good to look at the numbers and see where we are. Maybe Elsie needs to, again, support that particular report. But also, I think there were some areas of intervention that some people were very keen to look at. The issues around infrastructure, and I'm glad Richard brought it up, where there's improved infrastructure. For example, in the Albertine region, where we know what's happening in that area, what are the numbers telling us with the increase in number of accessible roads, but also areas where you've done some work in the education and health sectors? Are we able to look at that development transition into getting people out of poverty? The questions, especially around social media, YouTube, and Zoom, were really around the special interest groups, and whether we are able to pick out the data on those areas that are affected, especially where the people in those groups have fallen back into poverty. What is it that we need to do as a government? But also the refugees, and I know Richard, I think, raised that question. Have we looked at that data? And what is it we're doing with the refugees and bringing the refugees into this conversation? So that, for me, was some of the highlights I picked, especially on social media and the conversation that was being followed online. So allow me to invite Joseph. You're coming to do the last word and the way forward. And then as a member of the Fourth Estate, mine is, how do we disseminate this information? How do we translate this data into actionable points for the NPA? And is the NPA going to pick some of this data to inform, for example, the review they're doing, the NDP3 review, midterm review that is ongoing? So those are the conversations we want to hear, Joseph. So you're welcome, Joseph.
So thank you, Maurice, and to all of you for being a very, very engaging and patient audience. On behalf of the Minister of Finance, both the political and technical leadership, we want to thank you for today's engagement and your collaborative efforts that have brought us this far in this journey. I want also, in a special way, to thank the team that has worked with myself, this product has benefited from a larger segment within the Ministry of Finance. John Bosco, the MPA section, I see we have here Doreen, Martha. Some have since moved. I want to recognize that this has been a team effort internally. All of you who participated in the National Validation Workshop, that explains the product that we have. A lot of questions have been raised. Before I just give you a sense of our way forward, I would like us to reflect on a few, pillars. Number one, we are discussing this report in a context where 1 in 5 Ugandans is below the national income poverty line. That story was different 30 years ago. It was 1 in 2. What am I saying? Reducing poverty remains high on government's national development agenda, but it is no longer the sole development agenda item. The government of Uganda has more development agenda items than poverty reduction. At the Ministry of Finance, we have a vision. We are building a competitive economy for national development. A competitive economy has to deal with wider issues than the level of poverty. How do we boost our export competitiveness? Is a function of infrastructure, is a function of skills, is a function of institutions. I'm delighted that the infrastructure agenda has not been in vain. We have seen here that access to electricity, to roads, has impacted positively on poverty reduction. But there is more to development than reducing poverty. We have to compete on the international scene, and that means our businesses, the level of skills in our population must be at par with what other countries are doing. And so I do not want us to get sucked into one priority and lose sight of the bigger terrain that we have to navigate. I think the other thing we want to highlight here is the changing structure of how this poverty reduction agenda has been financed. You recall that there were days when almost more than 50% of our national budget was externally financed. That story has changed. A lot of the results we celebrate here today, we're able to celebrate them because Ugandans are paying their taxes. And I think that is something we should be proud of as a country. And so not only are we financing them through public investment, Uganda's level of savings, it's still low, but has made impressive progress. Today we are almost at the sub-Saharan African average of 20% of GDP. We used to be hovering around 10%, which means that the investment the private sector is making is because Ugandans are able to put aside some money to finance those investments. So those dynamics should be well appreciated as we discuss the challenges of today, that we have come a long way as a country, and we should be more grateful for this journey as we sort out the next problems. So what is the way forward? One, this is a very big report, but it's also very technical. And so working again with different segments of our partners, we are going to popularize this report, simplify it, but also distill the messages for different audiences. The other thing is cascade the intervention agenda to make sure that different people, as a ministry, I'm glad that both my PSST and the minister, very specifically, the PSST said we are here to listen. And my minister said, you are witnesses here today of Uganda's commitment to a culture of evidence-based policy making. So the whole idea of research, investing in data, data-driven decisions, is something that we have to continue to push. We salute our Bureau of Statistics, and the fact that they are almost fully funded. I think actually are fully funded by GOU now. That in itself is a big success story. We thank our partners who handheld you to come this far, but as Ugandans, we can be proud that our taxpayers are fully financing our Bureau of Statistics. That is not a common story across the continent. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. We'll have your contacts and we'll be communicating any other specific opportunities for engagement with you. I want to wish you a very pleasant lunch experience. I hope the hotel will deliver to that expectation. And journey masses to your destinations. Please spread the evidence. Thank you very much, our partners at UNDP. It's been a joy journeying this far with you hand in hand, and we look forward to furthering that journey. Over to you, Maurice.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the last time I request you to put your hands together. So specifically for the Minister of Finance and UNDP for inviting us and convening us here today. And I think what Joseph just said is that this is really the beginning of this conversation we are having. But what's very critical for every one of us, and I think everyone in this room has a responsibility to play when we start talking about issues of poverty eradication, and this is clear as SDG number 1, but we're not just really speaking to SDG 1, we are speaking to almost about 12 SDGs in the 17 SDGs when we address and tackle issues of poverty. We're also addressing issues of inclusion, we're addressing issues of social protection, I like the president keeps talking to the issues of socio-economic transformation. And the socio-economic transformation will only begin by all of us being part of this discussion around issues of inclusion and of course, and by the way, another one that we critically avoid, and maybe you didn't tackle in this particular report, but I know you had a space around climate change, is the protection of our environment. And that's going to be very critical. And I'm glad that lately the president, in every single address, is very categorical on issues of wetland management and how we're going to get people out of those wetlands, and we must get the people out of the wetlands, but also protect our Ramsar sites and be able to keep this environment as beautiful as it is and we're enjoying for our grandchildren, not our children, but our grandchildren. But I always tell people that we're going to be judged so harshly as a population when we are in our old age, because they'll say, what did you do about this? So when we invite our children and you're inviting them clearly to a wetland and you're saying, welcome home, and they can see that this is a wetland, they will hold us accountable. And history will really judge us harshly if we don't do enough to protect our environment, but also bring as many people out of poverty in one way or the other. Joseph, interestingly, someone said, and I'm happy you're talking about dissemination of this information, what's the role of the religious leaders in this conversation? And I think we need to bring everyone on board. So the stakeholder engagements we are having across the board need to also include that very critical mass, religious leaders and our cultural leaders. And so with that, I want to welcome you to lunch. The conversation continues. Please use the hashtag poverty status report, and then we can keep sharing as many interventions as we can in those conversations. We want to thank our online audience, the people on Zoom and those watching us online, for joining us for this launch. And lunch is in Royale, but for some of the others, you may notice you may have a different coupon that says maybe TOTS. So it depends on what your coupon says. So Royale or TOTS, please check your coupon to be sure where you're going, because you could be bounced at one of the doors. But lunch is ready, and bon appetit, and see you at the next launch, I guess, now that we will be looking at 2020 to 2022. All right, good evening. members of